Hello, everyone. We are now live. I'm joined today by Lloyd. We're taking a break from our series looking at the origins of Islam, the predecessors of Islam today, and we're going to instead to be looking at the subject which we call polemics, the long history of Muslim arguments, recycled garbage arguments, one might say, but the arguments that Muslims are forced into because they really don't have any other option. We're going to look both at the history and how to refute the arguments. By understanding where they're coming from, I think we can better address the arguments rather than just, you know, seeing the argument and responding to it directly. If we understand the origins of it, why Muslims argue this particular way, we can craft better responses. Let me open us with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the opportunity and the technology that allows us to connect with fellow believers and unbelievers from all around the world. We ask that anyone watching today approach the material with an open mind, that they get benefit from it, and that anything that we say that is true and useful is remembered and applied to people's lives, and that anything that we say is false is simply forgotten. We ask that you be with us today, that you guide our discussion and prevent us from theological error. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Any words of introduction you want to say, Lloyd?
Well, I think your audience generally knows who I am by now.
Yeah, probably.
So, for those of you who don't know me, hi, my name's Lloyd, South African, live in Warsaw, Poland. And yeah, as you know, I lived 11 years in the Middle East. My background really was in national defense. Yeah, I saw, I, I've been to many, many Islamic countries. I have worked within the culture. I've dealt with these people face to face, so I understand the culture very intimately. And it was from doing a course on counterterrorism that I really started to see the machinations of Islam that really forced me to take a deeper look into it. And yeah, today we're going to talk about Saint Paul and the Islamic polemics, which we find because Islam is such a traditional hierarchical culture, such an orally based culture, we're going to see that the polemics against Saint Paul go back something like 800 or 900 years, and the arguments made today are verbatim the arguments made in the 800s, the 900s, the 1000s, the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s. And we're going to see that the authors of these arguments are, let me see, to use the scientifically correct word, are idiots. So, some of the most revered Islamic scholars who are revered and lauded even by Western scholars, we're going to find out that maybe they were really good at whatever they're being lauded for, but their knowledge of history is sorely lacking, hysterically lacking. So yeah, we're going to have a look at that. So we're going to see that, and we're going to learn that the scholars who have derived these arguments had no idea what they were talking about. They are fools. They are total fools. I'll just leave it at that, and I'll prove my case.
There's a comment here from JIB. That was an excellent presentation yesterday. I assume that refers to your presentation since I didn't give one
I think
yesterday.
so. Thank you, Jabby. Yes, he commented then. Yeah, I'm starting to really flow with that material, and I understand it better. I'm presenting it better, and the host was also very engaging. Really good host as well. So it was really clicked very well. Although I will say it is on an atheist channel, so there were a lot of snide remarks in the chat, which I had to ignore. But it's just one would think they could stay on topic rather than try to push a particular agenda. I wasn't there to proselytize. You know, I mean that's not what I do anyway. I mean, as Thaddeus knows, I always say it. I would have just you fill in the blank, Thaddeus. I'm not going to say what it is I do, but I'm not there to proselytize. I would simply do something else. You know what that is.
There to destroy Islam, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's what I would do. That's what I would do. So yeah, yeah. Okay, so guys, another epic. Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, Thaddeus, for having me on.
All right. You can dive into the presentation whenever you're ready.
Okay, excellent stuff. So let's not waste any more time. So yeah, Okay, guys. So I think I am sharing now. Yes. So, guys, we're going to talk about Islam versus Saint Paul. This is called Polemics. I think it's a very catchy, appropriate title. I thought that up all by myself.
Well, we'll give you credit for that one.
Yeah.
Probably not
Sadly,
the
I
first
can't.
person ever to think of it, but you thought of it independently, so we'll still give
I
you
thought
credit.
I was. I didn't. Look, I did. I can't take credit for monotheism. I will say, and sadly, someone beat me to that. But I'm ever grateful they thought up monotheism. But polemics, I didn't Google it. I just thought that it was just appropriate. So, guys, um, some of the major sources. Thaddeus, I need to provide you the links to my major sources. I will do so. I'll send you a list for the comments, and I'll send you a list for maybe to pin in the comments, and I'll send you a list for the description later, so people can look at these sources themselves. Right. So, amongst the articles, and this is not a comprehensive list. It's just some of the major sources. This is on the Quranic accusation of scriptural falsification known as tahrif and Christian anti-Jewish polemic. This is by a very well-known scholar, Gabriel Said Reynolds. It's part of a very important academic journal. Then the Islamic image of Paul and the origins of the Gospel of Barnabas by P.S. von Koningsveld. Right, and that's this book here. And this guy, when he writes, it's so tongue-in-cheek. You can just tell the guy's laughing hysterically in the background. You just get that feeling he's having a ball with this, but he's got to be very straight-faced when he's doing it. So it's early Islamic perspectives of the Apostle Paul as a narrative framework for tahrif. This is a really good article by Michael F. Kuhn. Very hard to get hold of. I finally did. Excerpts from a New Gospel by Ernst Bammel and a couple of others. Arab Christians and the Quran from the origins of Islam to the medieval period with a typo, I see, and so on. So, guys, I will provide this to you. It's going to be very, very interesting. So, part one, Islam is the religion of deceit. In part two, we're going to examine the more famous Islamic scholars leading up to the Gospel of Barnabas, and part three. This doesn't mean 3 episodes. It just means that I'm breaking it up into segments, right? In Polemics part three, really, we do discuss, although I haven't actually done part three because, so the original information on St. Paul is generally very positive, right? That's the view. But you will find that early on, there were also these polemics against St. Paul. So there were both positive and negative views. However, there's actually also a large amount of neutral to positive evidence from Muslim scholars and historians. So it's really interesting. There was this dual strain, and obviously the polemical side won out, right? The polemical side eventually won out. So yeah. So okay, guys, let's start. So what we're going to learn today?
So,
Well, we're going to learn that today.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I was
Okay.
going to say we have a comment here. Why do Muslims hate Paul? And I was like, well, that's what we're going to learn today. So, very appropriate question to ask.
Yeah, no. So there will be things that we're going to learn as we go. Hey, Steffi Calligraphy's here. Long time no see. Um, yeah. And Mel, welcome. Good to see you. Juliet and End Time. Great to see you all. So we're going to learn how Muslim historians and scholars claimed that Paul, Saint Paul, was the king of the Jews because these complete idiots confused Paul with King Saul of the Bible because his name was previously Saul.
Well, they're just following the example of their prophet there who confused Mary and the mother of Jesus and the Mary, the sister of Moses. So, they're just following the example of their prophet.
Yeah. So, but this is a legitimate, serious historical era, and I think if these scholars are exposed, if this is known, then at some point people can realize that these Islamic scholars were a joke. Okay, Christians, according to Islamic narratives, they followed Islam for 81 years after Jesus died.
That's
So, according to
awfully
Islamic scholars,
precise there. What is special about 81 years? Or perhaps you'll get to that later.
that's a really good question, actually. Then Paul, who was a wicked Jew, according to the Islamic narratives, according to the scholars, he committed suicide for the purpose of destroying Christianity. Paul was a wicked Jew who killed himself to destroy Christianity. Yes.
Fascinating.
Right. I'm going to shoot myself, and you're next. Then we're going to learn how Paul, who was a really good Christian, tried to influence the Roman to kill the Jews.
Okay.
Yep. Then we're going to learn that Christians never thought that Jesus was divine, but Paul fabricated this entire idea. Then Paul invented the concept and the doctrine of the Trinity. Then we're going to learn that Paul caused the Crusades. And the whole point of Paul causing the Crusades was so that the kings of Europe could hide and defend the lies that Paul had written, because they were afraid that the Muslims would bring the truth into Europe. So they had to go and attack the Muslims to prevent them from revealing the truth.
That's fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Paul caused the Crusades. And then how a Muslim, and here's interesting, a believer, there's a heavy emphasis here on believers, the believers who saved Christ's original teachings, the true teachings of Christ, which was Islam. So, yeah. So your thoughts, Thaddeus, before we go further.
Well, we have a comment here from Swati, who I'm assuming is a Muslim. Paul destroyed the religion of Jesus. Well, we will see how well that holds up. Thank you for joining us today.
Islam destroys the religion of Jesus. Islam has mutilated the concept of God. And yeah, so we're going to find out how your scholars that you get these arguments from are complete idiots. Glow in the dark, that is correct. It's a lot of ad hoc arguments. It is all over the place. And yeah, it's just complete trash. You'll see this.
And then JIB commented on the Saul confusion here. This shows the shocking level of ignorance of Muslim scholars, and I think that's correct. When we look at some of their arguments, you'll see that in great detail, that they really have no clue what they're talking about.
Yeah, and want us to wonder if it was deliberate as well, if they thought they would never get caught. So let us continue. So Paul is set apart as a defender of Christianity. So in Galatians 1, we read of Paul, an apostle, not from human beings, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. There are some who wish to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, Paul was not appointed by a council. Paul was not selected or trained by one of the other apostles. Paul was visited by Christ. Paul was a persecutor of Christians, right? Paul was a persecutor of Christians, and Christ visited him, obviously, as on the road to, was it Damascus? And Paul thus, because of that experience, became a Christian and thus became a defender of Christ and left Judaism, right? So he is appointed by God directly rather than by other apostles. Right. So let us see. So now in 1 Timothy 4 we learn, now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. One of those individuals is in the chat right now, oddly enough. Right? And this guy can't spell to save his life. He's pretty much on the same level as his scholars.
You're referring to this comment, what was the religion of Jesuits?
Is that Jussie Smollett he's talking about? No, that guy faked everything, and he's definitely guilty.
Did he preach Christianity?
Oh man, that
well,
hurts
I don't
my
know
brain.
who Jesus is, so I guess I can't answer that question. But if you mean Jesus, well, Christianity, he didn't preach Christianity. He preached the completion of Judaism, which is what Christianity is.
So the world. So that's Alfonso. That's John
Yes,
Week.
that's very interesting that he's using the name The World, because I blocked that exact name. So apparently he's creating new accounts under the same name now. He's run out of names to use.
Yeah.
I am wondering if he uploaded his presentation about Paul like he promised. He said that he was going to upload it today, and
He's promised for how many weeks now? He's going to upload it today. I'll upload it on Friday. I'm going to put it on a 35K channel. I'm going to be on your show on Sunday, Thaddeus, and we're going to yeah, whatever.
Yeah, if he hasn't uploaded that presentation, I don't think that we should entertain any of his comments today. What do you think?
I firmly agree with you. So we can always check his channel. If it's not there, then he's clearly been lying to us for weeks now. And he failed to show up for his presentation, and multiple times now, multiple days, he has failed to upload his presentation. He says it's
going to be uploaded tonight. Well, you're welcome to listen to us, but until you upload this material like you promised, I will not be entertaining your comments, because you've lied to us about 5 times about this presentation already. So I'm not going to entertain comments from a liar.
Yeah. No, fair enough. So, guys, so basically, so Paul obviously affirms. Now, I've done a very lengthy series with Ask Truth on my channel discussing the what St. Paul taught in relation to what the other apostles taught, what's in the Bible. And of course, this is a one-to-one correlation. Paul was a first-class legal mind. He was a first-class legal scholar. He was next in line as the senior student of the chief rabbi. So he was in line to become chief rabbi one day. And that would mean he was one in 1,000 choice, which means he was highly trained, highly motivated, very knowledgeable. And thus he was able to take the ideas of Jesus and obviously create an exegesis, just like the imams in Islam had to take this little Quran, which doesn't even have the Shahada, nor you are skated of my questions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you're skated, Lloyd. Are you skated?
Um, Dude, come back when you're sober. Okay? Seriously.
I've put
Right.
him in timeout, so
Okay.
you may
So
continue.
he was a first class legal mind. He was able to take what Jesus had written and then apply that from a legal context. He was able to apply that from a moral context into the lives of Christians. And what we have is that where was it going to go? So and then also there are several warnings that he writes about people who are going to come along are going to twist the words of the New Testament and try to undermine the New Testament. So do not give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. And Paul is clear: salvation requires faith in Christ, not merely good works. He affirms everything that is in the New Testament. He does nowhere contradict the New Testament, even though Muslims would like to claim. And we're going to look at the root source of these crazy claims. So Islam loves to reframe, as we know. They do this reinterpretation. That's the major Quranic miracle. So Moses, Jesus, and all the biblical prophets were Muslims according to the Islamic word games, and they all practiced Islam. Their holiness was as a result of Muhammad's light within them. So Muhammad's light shone out from within them, right? And of course, the translation is what they literally mean, though, is that Muslims were quote unquote monotheists. So this was a form of proto Islamic monotheism, supposedly. So when they said they were Muslims, a Muslim doesn't mean that they practiced Islam the way that Muslims do today. They just mean that these were people that submitted to Allah, submitted to God. Now, of course, if you submit to God, you could be, I don't know, a Buddhist and submit to God. Does that make you a Muslim? No, it does not. So this is a very vague wording, and that's all they mean. This is literally all they mean when you read the source texts, that they just mean they were Muslims. They were people who submitted to monotheism. Now, translation: Islam is monotheism predating Christianity. Right, so they want to imply that there was this proto-monotheism, and Thaddeus, that actually lines up with what we discussed last night. Islam is
Yeah,
proto-monotheism.
it's
Yeah,
interesting. You put this presentation together originally a long time ago, but we're now discovering that the early Muslims were claiming to be going back to a religion that existed from before Jesus and even before Moses, say, because they say they're going back to the religion of Abraham before the creation of Judaism. Very interesting stuff.
yeah. And then, of course, we know that there was a form of monotheism which was called Hanifan, and this was known as a heresy. So it was similar to, had some of the trappings of both Christianity and Judaism, but was neither. And this was the monotheism that is well known. It's called Hanifan, right? And of course, this was known as a complete heresy. And this is a fourth, fifth century doctrine. And it had the god Rahman, which is the first name of Allah, which Muhammad stole from the Christians and the Jews. So Moses received an Islamic scripture, they claimed, the Torah, which was an Islamic scripture. Jesus received a book called the Injil, known as, which we call the Gospel. And remember, Jesus received a book. It's like he went to the library and checked out a book. It's not like the Injil is something written about Jesus after he died by people who knew him. No, apparently he was given a book, and when he went back up to heaven, he just gave each one a copy. He printed several copies and gave each of the apostles one. So Christian religious communities suppressed the religion of Jesus and altered the text, but the believers, the mu'minin, stayed true. And we have from a scholar called Yaqut al-Hamawi, who claimed, this is in the 1100s to the 1200s, he claimed to know of a Jewish convert with an original uncorrupted Torah. Of course, they don't have a copy of this Torah, right? Just as they claim that there's a 90-foot skeleton of Adam buried next to the Kaaba, which they somehow can't show us, and there are 300 fully preserved bodies of all the prophets of the Old Testament buried next to the Kaaba, and they can't seem to show us a single one. So now, the Bible correctly interpreted according to Islamic polemics is Islam. If you read the Bible correctly, if you interpret it correctly, you will find Islam there. And of course, we know that the creed of, if you look at the Nicene Creed, for instance, and you read it, it is a complete rejection and a refutation of the Islamic position. So we know already just from the church creed that this is a complete rejection and inversion. So Ali ibn Rabban al-Tabari was a Christian convert to Islam. In his Rad blah 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 al-Nasara, the refutation of the Christians, he proposed to show how Christians misinterpreted their texts. So the early argument was not that the Bible was corrupted, but that the Bible was misinterpreted. Let's have a look. Yeah.
This is exactly what the Quran says. It says that people were misinterpreting their texts. They were changing the words with their mouths. In other words, they're misinterpreting them. So it's not surprising that the early Muslims believed in the Quran and followed what it said. Unfortunately for them, they soon no longer had that option because it became not viable.
Correct. So he wrote, with the help of Allah, I will interpret the words which the Christians have explained in a way contrary to their meanings, as I described their tahrif. So this early scholar from this period, this is from the 9th century, right? So this is from the early 9th century. He was claiming, and these scholars were writing, that the Bible was not corrupted, the Bible was misinterpreted, that the words of the Bible were original, but the way that it was being read was wrong. So by following the plain meaning, according to this Islamic scholar, of their gospel, al-Tabari believed that Christians would arrive at Islam. All right.
Again, exactly what the Quran claims. So, he was just believing the actual words of the Quran, unlike Muslims today who tell us that the Quran is incorrect when it says that the gospel contains the same message.
Which is true. So, as we know, the Bible is the most well-attested book in history. It is the most well-attested book by far. Nothing comes close. When you look at some very important books, very well attested, very well received books, like say Homer's Iliad, there's only like 4 or 5 extant copies. And these copies, they are differences between them, but they confirm the authenticity of the Iliad. Now, when you've got 25, 30, 35,000 copies of the Bible, clearly this is well in excess of 4 or 5 or 6. Right. Now, Sir William Muir says on the Quran, what a mighty difference between the prophets of Islam and his followers of the present time. Muhammad professed to make the sacred scriptures of the Old and New Testament the foundation of his claims and his pillar of support when he was attacked by the Jews and the Christians. He referred directly to the Old Testament and the New Testament as evidence of his claims. But modern Muslims spend their days in the impious attempt to subvert the authority of those very scriptures. This is from William Muir, dated 1878. He was a major 19th century scholar of Islam. These arguments that Muslims make go way back. They were well known then, and they were well known prior to that.
Yeah, we read in the Quran that Muhammad himself is told to check up with the Christians and the Jews if he doubts the authenticity of his own message. The obvious implication being that Muslims should do the same. And they should check,
right.
if they doubt Muhammad's authority, they should check with the Jews and Christians to see if their scriptures confirm what Muhammad is saying about them.
Right. So yeah, there we go. So now Muslims filter the Bible through the Quran. Unfortunately, the Quran is filtered through the scholars. So when we say Muslims, I mean Muslim scholars filter the Bible, right, through the Quran. But unfortunately, the Sharia is what ultimately, this is the opinion of the scholars. The consensus of the scholars is what defines the interpretation, regardless of what the Quran says. For instance, if any Muslim can show me where the Quran shows 5 prayers a day, I would love to see that. If you can show me where the Shahada in the Quran shows Muhammad and Allah, I'd love to see that. They do not exist. So outside sources written by men, these hadith, these are the ones that actually ultimately carry authority, right? And those opinions by outsiders, by these scholars, have what made it into the Sharia and become the law. So let me see. It's not what the Quran says, it's what the scholars say the Quran says. And so we will examine Muslim claims of Christian, New Testament, and Old Testament biblical scripture falsification or corruption, known as tahrif, between the 8th and the 14th century in 8th and 14th century disputational and other scholarly historical works, okay, in relation to Saint Paul. So let's look at Tisdall. He says there is no satisfactory proof that an Arabic version of the New Testament existed in Muhammad's time. So here's the question: if there is no evidence of an Arabic New Testament, what New Testament was Muhammad using if none existed at that time? Because the earliest Arabic New Testament dates to the late 800s, right? Dates to the 800s. And oddly enough, in the Arabic New Testament, in the earliest known version of the Arabic New Testament, Jesus is not called Isa, Jesus is called Yeshua. Now, in the Orthodox Church of the day, the gospel was often neglected in favor of legends of saints, which appeal to the popular taste for the marvelous. In other words, myths like the Alexander myths, the Alexander romance, the Alexander legends, right? There were many, many popular myths that were told. These were stories, children's stories that became very, very popular. And in many cases, these stories actually made it into the Gnostic Gospels, and these Gnostic stories made it into the Quran. Aramaic. So the earliest Bible that is known to have been in no, there was no full Bible at that time. The Bible hadn't been completely compiled. So in Arabia, the earliest gospel that made it into Arabia, to my knowledge, is the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew or Mark. I can't remember exactly which right now, but I think it's the Gospel of Matthew that made it. Yeah, that made it, and it made it in, I believe, in Greek and Aramaic. However, it was eventually rapidly corrupted by the Gnostics, and several Gnostic versions arose. Several rewritten versions with Gnostic twistings arose.
Yeah,
Um,
to answer the question, if we assume that the truth that um, the historical figure behind what we know as Muhammad was a traveling trader, he probably came in contact. He probably didn't read the text directly, but he came in contact with Christians living in Syria. So they would have been reading, a Syriac version, which is commonly called Aramaic, incorrectly, but commonly called Aramaic. And he may well, and the Hadith seem to suggest that he also traveled to the south, so he probably came in contact with the Ethiopic, or at least people who had read the Ethiopic Bible. So, he could get these stories from a variety of places. He probably didn't see the text himself, but he certainly heard the stories.
so, according to the evidence that I'm working on, Muhammad, there's numerous references in the Islamic sources that Muhammad was listening to Ethiopians recite the Bible in Ge'ez, in the Ethiopic. And they would have services in Ge'ez because there was an Ethiopian Bible, I think as early as the third century, right? Third or fourth century, there was already an Ethiopian Bible written in Ge'ez. However, it was paraphrased into the Arabic. And of course, many of the monophysites were a heavy influence back in the day. And it was more of a heretical sect than what we would consider today, but that's a longer story.
Absolutely. So Dan Smith, and I don't know. I think this is probably a question about whether there could have been an Arabic Bible. He says, so because there is not a book available today or recorded means it never
So
existed.
apparently, there's a guy called John, also known as Johannes or Johannes, who was a Syrian monophysite priest, a heretical priest, who was commissioned apparently by a Saudi king of some nature back in the day, in the 5th century or the 6th century, who was asked to write the Bible in Arabic. And apparently, this took him like 3 years, and he did. So there are stories about that, but I cannot confirm that. So there are stories that claim that there was a Bible in the 5th century, 6th century, written in Arabic, commissioned by this Muslim king, but I can't confirm any of that. A lot of it's behind paywalls in academia, so I'm not going to pay for that.
Yeah. So the to answer the question, just because we don't have evidence of something doesn't technically mean it didn't exist, but we can't just assert something existed unless we have evidence. We don't need to have textual evidence of it, but someone should at least, reference that it existed or something. So as near as we can tell, the first Arabic translation of the canonical New Testament was probably in the 8th or 9th century, right around the time Muslims start making this claim that the Bible is corrupted, coincidentally, or not coincidentally. But there were texts available in Arabic for sure. There was a version or there was a book that claimed to be a version of Matthew. It's only known in fragments, so it's really hard to say whether it really had anything to do with the Gospel of Matthew. Um, but we can't just assert that something existed without evidence.
Right.
And then
Yep. So
before you go on, Steffi asked if we have a link for donations. I put the link to my Patreon in the chat, but if you want to pull up your donation links as well, Lloyd.
oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, I'll do so in a minute, but let me just continue here. Yeah, I was writing some answers to some. Anyway, so I had a guy following me around lately, making silly comments. So Arabia, we must also note Arabia. So you had Arabia Felix, you had Arabia Deserta, Happy Arabia, you had Arabia the Barren Desert, but also Najran was a major site of Christian pilgrimage in southern Arabia, very close to the border of Yemen, and that section of Arabia was given the name by the early church fathers of Arabia Heresium Ferax, Arabia the bearer of heresies, because these heretics were kicked out of Rome, kicked out of the Roman Empire, and they ended up in three places. They ended up in Haran, in Turkey, southern Turkey, northern Arabia. They ended up in Najran, and they ended up in Alexandria, Egypt. You'll find a lot of heresies come out of those three locations. So Arabia was a refuge for heretics of different sects expelled from the Roman Empire. And it is clear from the Quran that many of the mythical stories in the apocryphal Gospels and heretical Gnostic works reached Muhammad and were accepted as true. So we can see that the entire Christology of the Quran is not orthodox, it is entirely Gnostic. So in Tisdall, in the book called The Original Sources of the Quran, right, he has an earlier book called The Original Sources of Islam. Don't use that. This one is much more detailed. It's a follow-up to that, and it corrects a number of errors. He says Muhammad was never brought into contact with pure gospel Christianity. It is largely to the false forms, which the faith had then almost universally assumed that the rise of Islam is really due, because heresy was rife in that part of the world. Heresy and Gnosticism had assumed dominance. Basically, there were so many of them, and the apostles were fighting hard to get the message of orthodoxy through, but there were all of these competing forms of false Christianity at the time in that region. So let's have a look at the Mount Sinai Arabic New Testament Codex 151 from 867 AD. So the earliest New Testament Arabic translation is the Mount Sinai Arabic Codex 151. It's 253 AH, or 867 AD, and Jesus is called Yeshua, not Isa. This is found in Sinai, Egypt. And as I said, there's a story of someone called Johannes, or John, a monophysite or Nestorian, who was commissioned to write the Bible, but I cannot confirm any of that. There is this claim, though, that he wrote this in the 400s or 500s. Right. So now that we've seen that's the earliest evidence of a New Testament. So what was Muhammad reading if he didn't have an Arabic New Testament? We know that the two languages he apparently was capable in was Ge'ez, Ethiopic, and Arabic. But again, the Ethiopic was recited. There was no, so some scholars would read it, and yeah. But also at that time, those Ethiopian Christians were also what we would consider heretical today. That's changed since then. So that's changed since then. However, back then there was a bit of an issue. So let's look at Griffith, the Bible in Arabic, the scriptures of the people of the book in the language of Islam. The earliest evidence suggests that the earliest written translations of parts of the Bible into Arabic were made by Jews and Christians living outside of Arabia after the Arab Islamic conquest of the Fertile Crescent from the middle of the 7th century onwards, right? And they translated parts of it, it seemed, in response to the Islamic misuse and misconstruing the Bible. So they were translating the relevant portions in response to these false Gnostic polemics used by the Muslims.
And certainly we can assume that people who spoke multiple languages informally translated the parts of the Bible for people. I mean, that it would be ridiculous to think otherwise, but we don't have, written records of it. So it was available in some sense, but not like from a codex. It's available orally, it's available in fragments, but not in a complete version for sure.
While the world is back saying there was no Bible, your Bible didn't exist before the 16th century. We all know the Quran didn't exist before 1924 when it was dumped in the river, rewritten, and then in 1985, the Saudis rewrote the Bible, and now you have a new Bible. So the modern Quran. Sorry, my bad. They rewrote the Quran in 1924. They dumped it in the river and rewrote it. Then in 1985, they decided to get rid of that version and produce a new one. So now you have 37 different Qurans, as we all know. And the modern Quran is what, 85? That's 15 plus 22. So the modern Quran is 37 years old, dates to the late 20th century. The previous Quran only dates to 1924. I think he's talking about when the Bible was printed on the printing press. Now, that would be a whole different thing. But
Yeah. This comment is just so ridiculous. It actually contributes quite well to what we're talking about Muslim so-called experts not having the slightest clue what they're talking about. We have many complete manuscripts from before the 16th century, and yet he says it didn't exist at all before the 16th century. Amazing stuff. Before I block him, let's go ahead and address this comment as well. He said, Lloyd, the Quran confirms the Bible. Also, Lloyd, the Quran confirms Apocrypha to be authoritative. He thinks that this is a snarky comment that will refute us, but actually, yes, that's 100% true. The Quran confirms numerous texts that are not considered scripture by Jews or Christians as authoritative. It quotes from them, alludes to them, contains their stories. In other words, Muhammad didn't know what he was doing. He copied stories, either he knew where they came from and didn't care because he thought that they were authoritative, or he had no clue what he was doing. One or the other. Either way, he claims he's confirming the Bible, when he's in fact mostly quoting non-biblical texts. He quotes rabbinic commentary on stories, and he quotes Christian legends, and he quotes all kinds of stuff, but he rarely alludes to the actual biblical text. So thanks the world for bringing that out for us. And like I said earlier, since you haven't uploaded your presentation like you promised, and because you appeared again under a username I already previously blocked because of abuse before, we'll just go ahead and hide user on this channel again. Thanks for doing that, though. Thanks for bringing out that point for us before you went.
Excellent. Yeah.
Before we move on, a couple of legitimate comments here. From Juliet, the early Muslims were more honest compared to the 21st century Muslims who do bid'ah, which is eisegesis, which is correct.
Technically, it's innovation.
Well, yes, but eisegesis is innovation, don't you think? You're inventing a new meaning for the text.
Agreed.
We do have a question here from Eliab. Where did they get the name Isa from?
Yeah, one theory that I've seen is that the name derives from the Ethiopic. Others derive it from Syriac, Aramaic, Greek, but no one really knows, to be quite honest. I mean, I would tend to lead towards the Ethiopic because so much of the influence of the Bible seems to be Ethiopic in origin, because that was the earliest Bible in the region.
Absolutely. It's an open question. It's such a bizarre title that no one can really figure it out.
Yeah.
But again, it just kind of shows that Muhammad didn't know what he was talking about. He probably, most likely, he heard someone saying something similar to Isa, that sounded similar to Isa, because in their own language, the word for Jesus was similar, and that he misheard it or misremembered it.
Actually, there is okay, hold on. Okay, so just briefly, this is there was a god. Now, in the 4th and 5th century, the Arab Christians were calling God not Yahweh, because at the time, that Jewish tradition of not using the name of God was actually current. The whole idea of the Tetragrammaton was actually common. So they used a different name. They called him Ar-Rahman. Okay, so God was called Rahman or Rahmanan. Okay, so they would call God Yahweh, what's called Rahman or Rahmanan. This was in the 4th and 5th centuries. Both the Jews and the Christians called him that. Now, in chapter 59 of the Quran, it's the first time that they refused that Muhammad gives a name to Allah. Before that, Allah is just called the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. That dude, the guy, the big guy. That's all he's called. And then at one point in chapter 59 or 49, could be, they realize, oopsie, we forgot to give a name to Allah, and they decide to call Allah Rahman. Rahman was the name of the Christian and the Jews, and of course, this was a monotheistic God. Okay, monotheistic. right? A monotheistic Rahman, right? By the Christians and the Jews, as I said. Rahman is monotheistic, and then there was also Musaylama, who was another false prophet at the same time as Muhammad, who was also preaching a monotheistic religion, and the name of his God, and Muhammad had him killed eventually, right? Because they were competing and he didn't want competition. Musaylama was teaching a monotheistic religion based on Christianity, where the name of the God was Rahman. Okay. Now, on that, amongst the gods that were prevalent at the time was a god called Yasha. There was a god called Yasha. Okay, Yasha was a god that was a pagan Arab god, supposedly. Well, technically not pagan. This was a god that was an Arab god that could forgive sins. It was an Arab god that gave salvation and forgave sins, called Yasha. So if you think of Yasha and you think of Isa, I think that's a fairly close derivation.
What another probable theory? It's just such an unusual title that we can't really be sure. But you ask 10 different scholars and they might come up with 8 different explanations for where Isa
Yeah.
came from. But this one's perfectly plausible, especially given what we have seen recently about the number of pagan borrowings from Christian, or I mean, the number of Islamic borrowings from paganism. Totally misspoke
Yeah,
there.
because they had the religion that they called the Hanif, which was derivative of Christianity and Judaism. It actually wasn't. It was this monotheistic pseudo biblical religion, and this seems like one of the gods from that. Yasha, Isha, Isha, Isa, Yasha, Isa, Yasha, Isa. It's fairly close. I'd say there's a fairly close. Okay, so now the
Well,
Arabic
before
Bible.
before you go on, one more question here that was related. Uh, did Muhammad copy Arian texts? I know he did with the Gnostics, but what about the Arians?
So the Arians would have probably influenced some of the Gnostics. Look, I am going to do a series on that, except my notes are 300 pages. And I personally don't want to read to you 300 and something. It's more than, so I don't want to read to you 300 and something pages. I need to distill that down into like 50 or 60 slides or 100 slides, right? So if you look at the Islamic idea, it is very close to Arianism. It's also very close to many other Gnostic and heretical ideas. So Arianism was actually quite potent, quite longer than people realize. It did survive in places and it did influence others.
Arius didn't really have any distinct text, though. He just had a smaller version of the New Testament. He threw out a lot of the stuff and edited down the things that he accepted. So uh, this would be a really hard claim to state one way or another because
Hmm.
uh, Arius didn't really write his own texts. So, I mean, what would they be
Okay.
copying exactly?
Yeah, they rejected certain things. He rejected a lot of the Old Testament, I think, and this was a common thing amongst heretics and Gnostics. Actually, this is turning into quite an interesting historical discussion back and forth with you providing ideas and myself. That's actually very interesting. Actually, very interesting. Yeah, um, yeah. So you're right about that. Although I will tell you guys that the source of the hatred of Paul, does stem from a first century Gnostic cult, does stem from the late first century. So you can think within Christian, at least within the Christian milieu, your very first Gnostic, your very first major heretic is, at least who's identified by name, is Simon Magus, or Simon Magus, Simon the Mage. And then post him, the next earliest in history is a group called the Alkasai. And the group of the Alkasai teach hatred of Paul because they make the claim that this Gnostic group makes the claim that Paul corrupted the Gospels, that Paul was evil. So they spoke out harshly against Paul. So that claim actually derives from the very late first century, early second century. And so from the 95s onwards, from the year 95 plus, 98 plus, it dates. And then, or at least we can confirm it to like the year 102, 103, right? And then that gets taken up by the Manichaeans and the Nestorians, and others are influenced by this. And a lot of these ideas from this first group, because they had a book, and those ideas then spread. And many of those ideas made their way directly into Islam. So I'll talk about those guys another time. That's a very
Very good.
interesting story.
Yes, definitely. You may continue.
Okay, so the Arabic Bible appeared gradually. Understand, the Arabic Bible did not seem to, even though there is the story that Johannes was commissioned by this Arab king to write a full Bible. Apparently, again, as I said, I can't confirm that, but we know that the Bible occurred in drips and drabs. The occasional chapter, a couple of pages, a few verses that really appeared in drips and drabs. From the first centuries of Islam until the Middle Ages, Jews and Christians produced hundreds of manuscripts containing portions of the Bible, which may explain why the Quran also has these repetitive sections, and not only that, these very truncated sections. They suddenly just cut off. It's portions of the story. So before Islam, Jewish and Christian scriptures circulated orally. And we know this even from the Quran, where people would recite the Bible in gears, and Muhammad would listen. After the rise of Islam and the Quran's appearance as a scripture in its own right, Jews and Christians then translated the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament into Arabic for their own use, and also as a response to the Quran's retelling of all the biblical narratives. They tried to set the record straight. Then from the 9th century, there was a steady stream of Jewish and Christian translations that crossed national borders to influence the Islamic world. Why the 9th century? Well, that's when they invaded Spain, and that's when they encountered Christian Europe, and that's when they actually got their hands on an actual Bible. And in Spain, they read the Bible, and then they went, oopsie. So, yeah, your thoughts before I go on, Thaddeus?
No, I think that's exactly right. That these arguments that started to rose in response to Muslims finally getting in contact with what the Bible actually said. Up until the point where they could see the text for themselves, it was perfectly plausible for them to say, well, you know, what the Christians are claiming their text says, they're just mistaken or lying or however you want to put it. Once you see the text itself, not so easy to do anymore.
Yeah. So once they came into Europe and they got hold of an actual Bible, once they invaded and took over monasteries and actually read a Bible, then they realized that the Bible says nothing like what they've been claiming in the Quran, and they had to make a choice. Either the Bible's right and the Quran is false, and they went, well, the Quran's never wrong. The Bible was corrupted.
Yeah. Amazing stuff.
So now, in the Quran 25:4, but the misbelievers say, this is nothing but a lie which Muhammad has forged and others have helped him. And they say, these are tales of the ancients which he has caused to be written. They are dictated before him morning and evening. And in Quran 37:36, shall we forsake our gods for a mad poet? Now the Quran itself deals with the accusation by Muhammad's Meccan neighbors that Muhammad was Shair Majnoon, or a poet possessed by a jinn. Right? And this is actually very important in the culture, because a poet wasn't someone who acted alone. Poetry was inspired through the possession of a familiar. So the jinn were also demons that would possess the poet, and they would inspire the poet to speak and to make wonderful stories, make wonderful myths, and embellish. And this would give you great oratory skills. And the worse the demon, the more evil the demon, the more powerful the demon, the better a poet you were. And Muhammad was afraid of being thought of as someone who had a demon in him.
Very interesting stuff. And this is really quite shocking that the Quran contains all these accusations being made against Muhammad. And yet, when we give these same arguments to Muslims, they're like, well, if Muhammad was actually just copying the tales of the ancients, people would have been accusing him of that in his own day, but they weren't. What? It's in the Quran, buddy. Amazing stuff.
Yep, exactly. There's numerous passages. And so let's look in Da'if Bukhari, volume 3, book 48, hadith 850. Ibn Abbas said, O Muslims, how do you ask the people of the scriptures, though your book, the Quran, which was revealed to Allah's Prophet, is the most recent information from Allah, and you recite it, the book that has not been distorted? Allah has revealed to you that the people of the scriptures have changed with their own hands what was revealed to them. And they have said, as regards their changed scriptures, this is from Allah in order to get some worldly benefit. So now we know that even in the time of Bukhari, this is like what, middle 8th century, 9th century? 200 years roughly. And now we know that even then they were making the claim that the Bible had been altered. Ibn Abbas added, isn't the knowledge revealed to you sufficient to prevent you from asking them? That's the Christians. Because because Muhammad had made the New Testament and the Old Testament the bedrock of his proof, and he said, you will find the proof in the Bible. But of course, he's referring, as far as I can tell, to a Gnostic Bible. So when they came across actual Bibles, they realized, oopsie, the Bible doesn't say what Muhammad said it said. That was very, very embarrassing. But the tradition had been set that they should now refer and say, hey, Christians, look in your Bible. We're legit because your Bible says so. The problem is that Islam relies heavily on confirmation by the Bible to prove itself. And now they had to have polemics that try to excuse the fact that the Bible rejected what is in the Quran. And he says, by Allah, I have never seen a Christian asking a Muslim about what has been revealed to you.
Gee, I wonder why. This is actually an amazing hadith here because, it contains, it's kind of saying without saying what happened here. That Muslims were taking the Quran seriously and they were checking up with Christians about what their scriptures said, and they were finding that they didn't match up. So then they have to put these words back in the mouth of Ibn Abbas and say, no, 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 no. You already have the truth. Stop asking other people what the truth is. They don't ask you, so don't ask them.
I know it's embarrassing. It's really now in the Bukhari. Okay, what we have is the word tahrif signifies to change a thing from its original nature, and there's no man who could corrupt a single word of what proceeded from Allah, so that the Jews and Christians could corrupt only by misrepresenting the meaning of the words of the Bible. So, in other words, now according to Bukhari, Bukhari tells us that no, the Bible wasn't rewritten or edited; the words were not changed. What was happening is the Christians were misrepresenting the words. However, notice though that it states here now in Bukhari, it says they've changed with their own hands. So Bukhari's hadith contradicts Bukhari's own personal views.
Amazing stuff.
So Bukhari needs to make up his mind as to what exactly. Hey Adam, welcome and great to see you, man. Nice to see you here in the chat. So Ibn Hazm. Now let's talk about Ibn Hazm, the Spanish genius. Here he is, this Ibn Hazm, the Spanish genius, on the postage stamp. Okay, Spanish postage stamp. Now, in the 11th century, Ibn Hazm brought the accusation of textual corruption or tahrif of the Bible. Now, he was not the first. He was quite late in the game. He was 300 years late in the game. However, he was the guy that developed the polemic. He's the one that he formulated it into what it is today, right? And he set the tone for what came. He set the precedent for what came in the future. But he built on top of an older polemic dating to the 9th century. So, referring to Ibn Hazm, Gerhard Niels wrote the article, Why do Muslims believe the text of the Bible has been corrupted? And this article states as follows. In 1064, Ibn Hazm, from the ruling hierarchy of the Umayyad government in Cordoba, Spain, charged that the Bible had been corrupted and the Bible falsified. This charge was to defend Islam against Christianity because this was a defensive move, because Ibn Hazm came upon differences and contradictions between the Bible and the Quran. Because he rocks up in Spain, gets hold of a Bible, reads it, and goes, oops, oops.
Oops.
That's what happened.
Real quickly, can you go back to the Bukhari reference so I can?
Sure.
I think I just had the Bukhari reference. So I'm not sure if he wanted this one or if he wanted the hadith.
But this one, this hadith.
Yeah.
Daif Bukhari, Volume 3, Book 48, Hadith 850.
All right, thank you.
Just so you guys know, that's Sahih, okay? Just, there's just no point saying Sahih because some Muslim is going to tell you it's Da'if, okay? Yeah. Okay, so believing by faith, not with evidence, but of course Bukhari, as a good Muslim, now has to believe that the Quran is infallible. So believing by faith that the Quran was true, the Bible must then be false. And so he said, since the Quran must be true, it must be the conflicting gospel texts that are false. So one of the absolute giants of Islamic scholarship, one of the greatest imams to ever live, he says, well, now there is a conflict between the Bible and the Quran, so we need to declare the Bible to be false. But the present text, he says, must have been falsified by the Christians after the time of Muhammad. So this giant of Islamic scholarship says no, the Bible was corrupted after the time of Muhammad, which is interesting because now other scholars realize that got them in a hole. Now they've got to claim it was corrupted right at the start, before. But you see, going on this giant here after the time of Muhammad. Now, of course, this means that we can check the original biblical scripts prior to Muhammad and post Muhammad and realize that they are identical.
And if you think about this, makes sense that this is where you would go first because you're still trying to agree with what the Quran says, that in Muhammad's day they had the same basic message. So not knowing the textual history, he can make this assertion. Unfortunately for him, that proved false as well. So we can kind of see the polemic developing here, that they have to keep coming up with these new ad hoc arguments to save what the Quran says, instead of just taking the obvious step of saying, well, the Quran is wrong.
Yeah.
Boris says, why do Muslims lie so much?
It's a legal obligation upon them. They're legally required to lie. It's not only legal; it's obligatory.
And Adam says, wow, Ibn Hazm under the bus now. And we see this
Of,
every time we talk with a Muslim. They'll throw whoever they need to under the bus.
yeah,
Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabri, whatever, the Hadith, Bukhari, even the Quran. They'll throw it all under the bus when they need to.
yeah. So of course, now don't forget, if he's saying that all the texts up until say 620, right, all the texts until 610, let's say, are original biblical, which means if we have biblical texts prior to 610, then those must be the original Bible, right? So if we go to any of the Christian texts written prior to 610, those must be the authentic Bible that Muhammad was reading. So if you read that, then clearly that's correct. However, of course, when you get to the original Bible, let's say you get a Bible written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, you read that and it still conflicts with what Muhammad says, then clearly you have two choices to make. One, Muhammad didn't actually basically you come to the conclusion Muhammad wasn't reading the Bible because he's clearly reading Gnostic texts, because it's Gnostic Christology that's in the Quran, right, in the Islamic texts. So clearly, if you get an earlier Bible, according to this logic of Ibn Hazm, then clearly Muhammad wasn't, because it still conflicts, it's still wrong.
Yep, so, absolutely. Unfortunately, Ibn Hazm didn't live long enough to realize that his argument didn't work, but that's okay. Muslims have come up with new arguments. They'll just keep changing the argument until they get something that works, I guess.
Exactly. So there are two kinds of tahrif, or two kinds of corruption. Recent scholars claim that early Islamic scholars argued that the Christians had misinterpreted their scriptures. The truth is that both arguments ran generally roughly parallel with each other in time. This is described as tahrif al-mana, a corruption of meaning, a misinterpretation. Right? You misunderstand and you misrepresent. This is different from changing the words, editing it, right? Called tahrif al-lafz or tahrif al-nas, which is textual corruption, often characterized as the later view. Muhammad was confident, though, that the Quran was the same revelation given by Allah in the Arabic tongue which had been given to others earlier in the Bible. So Muhammad is very confident within the Quran that what he's saying and what's in the Bible are identical. Now, sure, what he's saying is identical with the Gnostic scriptures for sure. So clearly he was reading the Gnostic scriptures, not the actual Bible, because I think he was reading Gnostic Gospels. And then, of course, the scholars of Islam realized this was entirely wrong because they actually got their hands on a full Bible.
This is amazing stuff here. Just real quickly, of course, Muhammad could be confident that he was revealing the same thing because he wasn't getting revelation from Allah. He was just repeating things that people were telling him, and or he was reading himself. So he knew it was the same because he had been told the stories and then he repeated them. Oh, I'm getting another revelation from Allah. I just heard from my friend about this other Christian story.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I hope you don't mind if we're going a little bit slower, because now we're actually having quite a conversation regarding the text. So it's not.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, but it does bring up a lot of things, and I tried to make this one not just the facts, but try to really broaden the picture a bit and bring in a lot of information around the source before I go into the actual ridiculous claims they make.
Yeah,
but this is an important.
This is very important foundational material that we we can see why the argument developed before we get to the actual argument. And I think that is a really important piece of the puzzle, because if we just respond directly to the argument, we're kind of missing the motive behind the argument, and we're not necessarily responding to the most important points.
Yeah, I'm also summarizing. I'm using a dozen different documents and books here. So I'm obviously summarizing literally probably 2,000 pages. So obviously I'm not going to sit here and read you 2,000 pages worth. So I'm just trying to give you a rough outline that this is what is generally within the textual documents that I'm utilizing. And Basil Get Blast has a very interesting question. Is it possible that the shift from the diatessaron to the four gospels in the Syriac Christian tradition in the 4th century is what underpins the accusation that the text was changed? Actually, I haven't thought of that. I haven't come across that, but then I haven't gone into depth into that, but that's a possibility. What do you think that is? I mean, it is possible
Yeah,
that
I
they saw the
mean
one
that.
book and then the 4 books, and then
Yeah, it could be an echo. That they were somewhat familiar with this historical change, where the diatessaron, which is a summary of the four gospels, a harmonization, to use the modern term, became for a while it was the most popular text. If the church really wanted to do what people accuse it of, and just go with the best sounding story or the simplest text, or what best fit their beliefs, they probably would have just adopted the diatessaron. But what they actually wanted to do is go with the authentic, go with the original. um, but like he says, it was definitely the most popular version of the text. It was used in church services and whatnot in some places.
well,
And the fact
which
that,
geographical region was the diatessaron used? Because if I go into my notes on Southern Arabia, which I need to get into early Christianity in Southern Arabia, there were vast numbers of these Gnostic Gospels, and we know that the Gnostics were highly motivated, and they were writing books from the 1st century already, late 1st century. They were writing full Gospels, plagiarized largely from like Enoch. They stole largely from Enoch and other mythological Jewish works, right? And even Manichaeanism, which also made its way into Islam, as Adam Seeker will know about that as well. He was a prolific writer, so they loved to write. They were very motivated to write. So there was a lot of this stuff floating around in Arabia.
yeah, and I think that the debate over the canon, the memory of the debate over the canon, had pretty much been settled by the 7th century when Muhammad came along. But the memory over the debate over the canon definitely could be underpinning some of these ideas, or Muslims went seeking for explanations after fact, even more likely, when they discovered that their text didn't match up. And then they discovered this in the history of Christianity, and they're like, aha, we gotcha, you did change things. So that's certainly a plausible explanation. It's conjecture, but I think it's plausible. It's worth looking into for sure.
Yeah,
He
he
also
does say
offered.
that. Yeah, this is an interesting. I mean, this is actually very interesting, Basil. Get good catch. I'd say this is actually quite an interesting catch. What do you think that is?
Yeah, he offers the second possibility here, that the adjustments and scare quotes in the Masoretic texts in the 8th century, um, obscuring the Christian prophetic interpretation of the passages, could also have motivated Muslims. This one's especially interesting because if we look at who Muhammad was historically, who the primary author or authors of the Quran are, they seem to be rabbinic Jews. They seem to be familiar with the Talmud, which is not something that someone outside of a rabbinic circle would be familiar with. They probably The author was probably kicked out of Judaism as a heretic, but nonetheless he was familiar with the texts. So if he was familiar with um, the the adjustment of the text, as in they added the vowel points, which ruled out some possible readings of the text that were possible without the vowel points. Um, that's definitely could be a motivation for the early Islamic community, especially if they're growing out of a primarily Jewish background, which I believe they were.
Interesting. True. Good point. Good call. So the Quran says, right. So the Quran has a very high view of the scriptures, which they call the Torah, the Zabur, and the Injil or Evangel. You'll see in the Sirah, the Gospels of Muhammad, that they often call the Gospel the Evangel, which is known as the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel. We believe in Allah and that which is revealed unto us, and that which was revealed unto Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and that which Moses and Jesus received. Now we know that Jesus did not receive a book. Jesus never received a book. And that which the prophets received from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them. Quran 2, 136. Except, of course, they do make a distinction amongst them. But, so it is surprising that Muslims of subsequent generations accuse Christians and Jews of tahrif and heavily blame the Apostle Paul for it. Right? So indeed, Allah has purchased from the believers their lives and their properties. In exchange for that, they will have paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah, jihad, so that they kill and are killed. This is a true promise, binding upon Allah in the Torah and in the Gospel and in the Quran. Quran 9:111. Now, Muhammad has now written himself into a corner, because we need to find that Allah has purchased from the believers, again, the mu'mineen. Understand this, he's calling the Muslims not Muslims, mu'mineen, the believers, and they will have to kill and be killed in the cause of Allah, jihad, so that they will have paradise. So now we've got to find in the New Testament, hop to it, where do we find that Allah promises Jesus' followers that if they kill and they are killed in the name of jihad for Allah, that they will have paradise?
Yeah, I can't
Unfortunately,
think of a verse, unfortunately. Or
correct.
fortunately, really.
So this verse obviously we'll going back to this verse later, but Muslim scholars attempt to explain it away by blaming Saint Paul. So this mistake that the Quran makes, that it claiming that this is found unambiguously in the Torah and found unambiguously in the Gospels, which we know for a fact is not in the Gospels. Clearly they had some other kind of gospel, or they were drunk at the time. Pick your favorite explanation, but this does not appear in the Gospels, does not appear in the Torah. And the only way that they could explain this away is they blamed Saint Paul. So let's look at replacement theology. So the main villain in the Muslim allegations of tahrif of the original texts of Allah is Paul, the apostle. In short, Muslims deceitfully claim to defend true Christianity, and this was the claim they made back in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, as they undermine the Christian faith to replace it with Islam. So let's have a talk about the bad rabbis and how Paul, the king of the Jews, took a bribe from the rabbis, left his kingdom, became a poor Christian to destroy Christianity. The rabbis went to the king and said, hey, we'll give you a little bit of money. You leave your throne. You go join the Christians. You destroy them. I like that. Did Paul corrupt the Quran? That's a fair question. I think we need to do some research on that. So Ibn Hazm writes, their rabbis, on whose authority the Christians have adopted their religion, the Torah, as well as the books of the prophets, peace be upon them, agreed to bribe Paul the Benjaminite. So the rabbis, okay, so the Christians have adopted their religion from the rabbis. And those rabbis agreed to bribe Paul the Benjaminite. May Allah curse him. They ordered him to profess outwardly the religion of Jesus and to deceive Jesus' followers and to induce them to follow the doctrine of Paul's concept of Jesus' divinity. And they told Paul, we shall take upon ourselves your sin. And Paul was extremely successful, as is generally known. So, as you know, this is now a slight reference to where the rabbis say to Pontius Pilate, we'll take this guilt, this blame upon us if you kill Jesus. So that's just a paraphrasing of that story. But your thoughts, that is, this is
Yeah,
one of the...
this is an amazing accusation here, that the rabbis were upset because some people had adopted their religion. How dare you join Judaism? We don't want you here. We're gonna trick you into leaving our religion.
Yep. So Paul, okay. Now you must understand that Paul, in this story, as we'll get to later, no one knew this. Adam, precisely.
Perfect story. No holes in this at all. I mean, airtight. I mean, everyone knows that the rabbis bribed Paul to lead people out
King
of
Paul,
Judaism.
King Paul.
King Paul, yes, King Paul to lead people out of Judaism.
Yeah, we'll get into this one. So this is apparently what happened. So yeah, Adam, I mean, hysterical stuff. This, right? So Paul was very successful in corrupting. So Paul introduced the doctrine of the Trinity into Christianity. Paul introduced this doctrine. Okay, so now there are three main Muslim accusations against Paul. Paul is a villain in the Muslim allegation of altering the original gospel brought by Jesus, making Christians heirs to an inferior view of Allah, and Christian scriptures therefore untrustworthy. There are three accusations against Paul that crystallized in the 11th century. Notice that is 1,000 years after the Bible, the Gospels were established.
And
Right.
400
So
years after Muhammad, no less.
fair point. Exactly. It's 400 years after Muhammad. And these ideas crystallized with Ibn Hazm and another man called Abd al-Jabbar. Abd al-Jabbar, he's on par with Ibn Hazm. And what is interesting is that this is the guy that really set the precedent that Muslims don't defend Islam, they attack Christianity. This is his precedent. This is the polemic that he created. Muslims never defend Islam, they attack Christianity. They don't prove Islam true, they work to prove Christianity false. They attack Christianity. That was his doing. Now, these claims are integral to the Muslim doctrine of tahrif. 1. Paul corrupted the laws or the practices of the true religion, abrogating circumcision, allowing unclean foods, and introducing Roman customs. 2. Paul corrupted the doctrine of the Tawhid by fabricating both the doctrines of the Trinity and making Christ divine. 3. Paul corrupted the text of the Bible, physically edited the text. Let's look at Ibn al-Jabbar's proofs of prophethood, the proofs that made Muhammad a prophet. So he writes about what the Jews and Christians believe. And he says, the day before the crucifixion, Jesus was crowned with thorns. He was then taken around, seated backwards on a donkey around town. Jesus was then given vinegar to drink, and when he asked for water. And then Jesus was crucified in a field of melons and vegetables. Hold on. I'm feeling a need to look up what the heck a melon is. Let's have a look at what melons are. I need to know what. Good grief! Oh no, my bad. Typo. Melons. So Jesus was crucified very specifically in a field with melons. This is Allah knows best. This is the secret knowledge. Melons, people. Melons. Jesus was crucified in a field of melons and vegetables.
I'm dying over here. This is just so funny. I'm sorry. And this is given in all seriousness.
This guy's deadly serious. He's one of the top scholars of Islam to ever live. Yeah.
Go ahead and finish the slide, and then I'll have a couple comments.
So Christians abandoned the Mosaic law. Well, we don't follow the Mosaic law. That's for the Jews. Duh. Casts blame upon Paul for having introduced Roman customs, or the prohibition of divorce, for instance, and circumcision, and turning in prayer to the east, and eating of pork, etc., because they believe that we're supposed to turn towards Jerusalem. Okay, so Paul introduces all of these innovations, this bid'ah, and then Paul betrayed the first Christians to the Romans. See, Paul betrayed them to the Romans. So Ibn Jabbar rejects Christianity's historical basis because he invented his own history. He rejects the integrity of the Gospels, claiming they are of later origin. I wonder, didn't some guy just say the Bible was written in the 1600s? Mm-hmm. Well. Mm-hmm. To replace the original Gospel taken by the Jewish Christians when they fled Jerusalem. So historian, we'll get into it later. So basically in the 3rd century, the Romans, or 2nd century, the Romans invade, the Jews have to run, they grab their scrolls, they run off, and then they blah blah write the new gospel. So basically the gospels are of much later origin to replace the original gospel taken by the Jewish Christians when they fled Jerusalem. So the original gospel was taken by the Jewish Christians, they buggered off, and then Paul and his guys wrote a new one. Paul used every trick to gain power and influence. He was a tricky little Jew, according to them. And on his Christology, all this points, in the opinion of Pines, now that's another very well-known Western scholar, modern scholar on the subject, to the background of a Judeo-Christian community. This reinforces another, thing that we discussed, that is. This reinforces the background of a Judeo-Christian community, even more so the details on the life and teaching of Jesus, i.e., Ibn Jabbar misread, misunderstood, or remixed previously existing apocryphal, Gnostic, and Jewish anti-gospel narratives like those in the Toledo Yeshu. So in the Toledo Yeshu, just to diverge briefly, so what you've got is you've got Jews that are reacting to Christianity, and you've also got Messianic Jews that have, shall we say, a heretical view of Christianity. They're Christian Jews technically, but heretical. And the Toledo Yeshu was a Jewish rabbinical text that was a polemic against Jesus. And in this case, Jesus is taken around on the donkey, if I recall, and then they take him and they hang him on a tree in a field of wheat or something like that. So the story of the Toledo Yeshu is altered by Jabbar, and now you get the melons and vegetables.
Ah, very interesting.
It's very similar. It's actually very similar in structure, and the story is almost identical to one in the Toledo Yeshu. So he stole it from the Jews.
If you could go back to the melon slide really quick. We have a couple comments here. Villainous says, you have to laugh, but it's so sad that people can seriously think this, and that's true. And Arnold said, Thaddeus, please be serious. This is deep stuff, deep stuff. And I did want to comment on the actual content here, though, because you can see how this is clearly derived from the canonical text. Jesus did ride on a donkey, not the day before crucifixion, but of course the week before, as he triumphantly entered Jerusalem in what we now call Palm Sunday. And he was given vinegar, or at least offered vinegar, but that was on the cross, not at the day before. So they kind of have taken some elements of the story and completely changed them to make a different story. So we can see how it derives from the biblical text, and the fact that the scholar says it was filtered through this anti-Christian text just makes that more sense, and apparently explains the field as well. I bet you that the field originally derives from a misreading of a particular word, like they changed a letter or two, misread the word, and then, something that said something completely unrelated suddenly becomes a field. But
Yeah.
I'll have to check out the Jewish text. I'm not familiar with that, so I can't comment on it directly,
Yeah.
but I'll definitely look that up, and I bet you we can figure out exactly
So the
where
Toledo
that
Yeshu, or
text.
the Sefer Toledo Yeshu, is the book of the generations, or the history life of Jesus. Often abbreviated as Toledo Yeshu, is an early Jewish text taken as an alternative biography of Jesus. It exists in a number of versions, and you'll find that the Islamic story exists in a number of versions, none of which are considered canonical. And they tell the story of how Jesus was crucified, and it's a completely fake story. And it was designed as a polemic. It was designed to ridicule and to make fun of the Christians, because obviously there was a lot of animosity between them, right? And they were fighting over this whole idea of Jesus because they were separating from Judaism, and the Jews were obviously fighting back. There was this massive back and forth, and these Jews were writing these obviously sarcastic polemics, and the Muslims thought this was legitimate.
We have a fascinating comment here by Balzetti. A certain ancient Egyptian church circa the 11th
Ethiopian.
century. Sorry, Ethiopic, misread. Circa the 11th century, among the wall paint shows a certain naked, bearded man being led off the gospel scene riding backwards on a camel. Probably a direct response to this story here of Jabbar. So you can see how it goes back and forth between the Christians and the Muslims. So the Christians heard this ridiculous polemic, and they made fun of it by drawing pictures of Muhammad being drawn off on a camel. Great stuff.
Yeah. So that's very, very interesting. Yep. So let's continue. So guys,
real quickly before you move on, we did have a serious question here, and how did you find this text? It was actually given a little bit earlier in response to the first polemic, but just in general, how did you come across these bizarre Muslim polemics that we no longer hear about, but clearly were important in early Islam?
I started looking to the history of Tahrif, the accusations of the corruption of the Bible, and of course, I was also very curious because at that time we'd suddenly I was being hit with because I'd done a series on St. Paul, and two things: one, Mal from Sneakers Corner at the time actually asked me to look into St. Paul because he needed some information on St. Paul, and he said he may want me to do a presentation on his channel. And two, I just finished my stuff on St. Paul, and I was getting hit with a lot of Muslim polemics against St. Paul. And then this whole idea of the tahrif came up, and I started looking, and I found various papers that went through old Islamic scholarly works on the topic, on what is this polemic against St. Paul and the accusation. Well, generally look into the accusation of the corruption of the Bible, and you'll find that St. Paul kind of pops out.
Excellent.
Yep. So fine. So there you go. So the Islamic image of St. Paul. Now, originally, this starts with a guy called Saif Umar. Okay. So Islamic historian, and this is a proper historian, Saif Umar al-Tamimi, who died in 797. Okay. This is late 8th century. So this guy is like, quite a while late within the Islamic narrative after Muhammad died, and also late in the Christian story, because I mean this is like 700 years after Christianity is founded. He reports in his folios, which were found, of a manuscript discovered by Qasim al-Samarai in the library of the Islamic University of Imam Muhammad ibn Saud in Riyadh. And they find in there fragments of his Kitab Masir Ali wa Aisha and Kitab al-Ridda al-Futtu, whatever that means. But Saif ibn Umar, okay, was an early Islamic historian and a compiler of hadiths who lived in Kufa, of all places. Kufa in Iraq. Kufa keeps coming up in this story. This is where all the hadith were compiled by, Bukhari and all of that. Saif Umar discusses Paul's adverse influence on early Christianity in a discussion on the factors which led to the assassination of Caliph Uthman. So somehow, because Islam's religion of peace, that's why Uthman was assassinated. So, and what he says is that, so his story of Paul is a parallel to that of a guy called Abdullah bin Saba, a Jew from Sana, who was called Ibn al-Sauda because he had a black mother. So the story of Paul is very much based on a story that was, because there's a story of this black guy who was a Jew who tried to corrupt Islam, and this Jew, you see, he caused the split within Islam between the Shias and the Sunnis, because so they had to blame it on somebody, and they created this black Jew. So because there was a conflict now between Christianity and Judaism, because the Bible was clearly in contradiction, so therefore they had to find a scapegoat, and they based it on the same idea, and they blamed Paul. So Ibn Sabah is said to have converted to Islam in the time of Uthman, and he traveled through various countries in order to lead the people astray. So in other words, he wasn't really a Muslim. He just faked conversion, and he tried then as a Jew to undermine Islam. So he started in Hijaz, went to Busra, then he went to Kufa. That's Syria. And then he continued to preach in Al-Sham, but was unable to mislead any of its inhabitants because the Muslims are too smart, And he was expelled to Egypt. He then taught that Muhammad was more worthy to return than Jesus. He thus laid down the doctrine of the return, and he then taught there were 1,000 prophets, and that every prophet had a regent, and Ali was the regent of Muhammad. And his next teaching was that the doctrine that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, while Allah was the seal of the regents, whatever that means in Islamic theology. And then Ibn Saba developed a doctrine which became the basis of the great discord between Shiite and Sunni Islam, just exactly as Paul had laid down the basis for the discord between the different Christian sects. Paul is the guy who caused the split between the Christian sects. See, because after Paul, the church split into the Nestorians, into the Jacobites, into this group and that group. So Paul caused that in the 1st century. Of course, the fact that many of these groups only rose in the 5th and 6th centuries and 4th century, that's not important right now. Don't confuse yourself with the facts.
This is actually fascinating. I mean, I assume that this story of Ibn Saba is probably completely fabricated, but I believe it predates the accusations against Paul, correct?
Say again? Sorry?
The origin of this story against Ibn Saba predates the polemics against Paul, yes?
Yeah. Because they had to blame something on how Islam split.
Yeah, so they invented this story to explain something in Islam, and then they recycled it when they needed to say something against Paul.
Yeah. It's just a recycled story. Yeah. So
amazing.
That's exactly it. And we're going to see now. So, okay, as we know, Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. I didn't know the prophets needed a seal, but Okay, fine, fine. They said it, not me. Right, moving on. So let's look at the Islamic image of Paul given by Saif Umar. So Saif Umar, his death is often recorded in roughly the end of the 8th century, and he may have lived until 809, but the record is very unclear. And he is the earliest source for all of these polemics against St. Paul. Al-Tabari chose him as the main source for Al-Tabari's own history of the early Islamic conquest and the wars of apostasy. So this guy is so well established but almost completely unheard of. But Al-Tabari's 40-volume history of Islam is based largely on the works of this guy, Al-Tamimi. Al-Tabari, though, completely ignores every word of Saif's account of Paul, doesn't include a word of it. So,
So yeah, it shows us that Al-Tabari did not consider these stories to be reliable.
yep,
We always, whenever we bring up Al-Tabari, we get this accusation. Al-Tabari just copied everything. He didn't try to judge what was correct and what wasn't, as a way to escape what he writes. But he 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 apparently is indiscriminate in what he copies. But even he sees these arguments against Paul as total nonsense. Amazing stuff.
yeah, very, very interesting. Other scholars often regard Saif as unreliable, with complaints about identifying the transmitters in his reports. But Saif seeks to warn Muslims about divisive figures who will undermine the true religion by lying aplenty, as we shall see. So, Saif Umar tells us about Paul's trick. So, after the assumption of Jesus, right, after the ascension, Jesus' followers numbered 700 families. He counted them. Paul, who was the king of the Jews, whose kunya was Abu Shaul, urged that the Christians be killed, but they succeeded in escaping. So Paul warned the Jews that the followers of Jesus would gain their enemies' favor and then come back with an army to wage battle against the Jews and kill them. So the rabbis accepted King Paul's suggestion of using a trick to prevent the Christians coming back to kill the Jews. Paul leaves his royal kingdom, he leaves his throne, and he wore the Christians' clothes, quote unquote. Actually, it's in the text. He wore the Christians' clothes, and then he went to the Christians' army to deceive them.
Uh, can you help me out here? What are the Christian clothes?
I don't know. I mean, if I have no idea, he wore the Christians' clothes, so
I
your
was
guess is
unaware there was a uniform for being a Christian. I mean, I think he's kind of thinking this as an army, right? Like the Paul's army, Paul's army, as the king of the Jews, is facing off with the army of the Christians, but he decides to trick them and take and wear their uniform. I don't know. I'm sorry.
so Paul was the king of the Jews. I know it's ridiculous, but Paul was the king of the Jews. Bazalgette says, was he confused with King Saul? Yes, he was. Yes, he was, because as you know, King Saul, um, King Saul upset God. God was very upset with him, and what he did was he killed himself by he falling on his sword, right? So he committed suicide. So what? King Saul commits suicide out of remorse. Okay, so then this Christian's message is appealing. This is now okay. So basically the rabbis are saying this Christian's message, Jesus, his message is appealing, and some of the Jews have gone to your enemy. They are still acting as the benefactors of the Christians. Soon they will come riding against you, the Jews, with the aid of your enemies, unless you pay heed to what I'm about to say to you now. Then he pursued them, the Christians, with the intent to lead them astray. So Paul goes now to lead the Christians astray, okay? Because Paul is a very tricky guy. So he goes to deceive the Christians. So Paul is a liar who lies to the Christians. So Paul teaches that everything from the beetle to the elephant is licit. In other words, permitted. So Paul goes to the Christians and says, okay, guys, you can eat anything from the beetle to the elephant. Check. And the Christians go, okay, good stuff, right? So this is a reference to Mark 7:14. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside of a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them.
Yeah, amazing here that that these are actually the words of Jesus, but now that they become the words of Paul, they just do whatever is needed. King Paul of the Jews. Amazing stuff here.
Yeah, so Paul is the king of the Jews. I mean, I'm sure the Muslims have plenty of evidence to prove that because this is from the absolute best scholars. Okay. So now this is some of the polemics by Ibn Qayyim in the Guidance to the Uncertain in reply to the Jews and the Christians, the Nazarenes they have here. Their religion is drinking wine, eating pork, abandoning circumcision, indulgence in adoring unclean things, permissiveness in eating everything that is unblessed for human consumption, from an elephant to a gnat. So this polemic goes through now. This is not the 13th or 14th century we're looking at. So these ideas have now gone from the 8th century and are persistent 400, 500 years later, right? Within these books that have established the Islamic polemic against Christianity. To them, what is lawful and unlawful is what the priest decides, and their religion is what he sanctions. And it is he who forgives sins and salvages them from the chastisement of hell. Now, Saif Umar tells us about Paul's false visions. So the Christians praise their Lord for the miracle of Paul's capture. I don't know how they just suddenly get to his capture, but he goes to them, he convinces them otherwise, and then they capture him. At his request, at Paul's request, they bring him to their chiefs, and Paul tells them, I've met Jesus. Jesus has taken my hearing, my sight, and my reason. But when Jesus returned these faculties to me, I promised that I would serve the cause of Jesus and the cause of his followers, and I will teach them the Torah and its rules. So the Christians believe Paul, and on his orders, they build him a house where he devotes himself to a religious life, and then he locks himself into the house. And he tells the Christians that he had a vision in which he was instructed that the only correct direction for prayer was towards the east. So they believe him, and they leave the Qibla. So they believe him, and I just want to go and see if I have anything that.
Well, you're bringing that up. We
Yeah.
had some disruption from Steve Kahn in the chat. He was trying to spam for us to all go over to EF Dawa and dispute with them there. Then I told him that he should engage with our comments, with subject. And he said, I tried to engage with you before, but you couldn't even answer any of my questions. Well, Steve, I put the link to this live stream. You can come up right now, ask whatever question you want, and we will engage with you. But as soon as you prove yourself a fool, that'll be the end of it. So come on up. I put the link in the chat. Here's your opportunity. I won't even make you be on topic. Come on up, engage with whatever you want to engage with.
Right. So Paul then convinces them that all food is permissible, and after a third vision, he convinces the Christian it was their duty to abolish any form of violence and revenge. So the Christians accept this, and they abolish military jihad, turning the other cheek instead, according to Saif Umar. This is why Quran 9111, which mentions that jihad will be found in the New Testament. No, Paul changed the Bible. Paul was the one that convinced them to get away from jihad. We're supposed to make jihad as Christians. Jesus apparently taught jihad, and now we turn the other cheek instead. So this corruption of the Bible, this 9111, is explained away by Paul getting rid of jihad. Briefly, east is liturgically in the direction of the altar, whether it faces true east or not. Okay, in a traditional church, blah, blah, blah. So this is just an old practice that facing east is an ancient tradition grounded in the knowledge of the second coming. Okay, but this is not. So as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, this is not a literal east. It's just an old practice. It was never taken literally. Okay, not every church was built facing the east. So that was entirely symbolic. But notice, this is how they explained away the mistake in the Quran for 9111, that there's no mention of jihad. Paul abandoned jihad. So,
but wait a minute. I thought he was the one that was fighting against the Christians in that previous part of the narrative. What do you mean he abandoned jihad?
so Paul says they must abolish any form of violence. This is why there's no mention of jihad in the New Testament. This is how they explained away Quran 9111. This is the excuse they made up, that Paul did this. And on the prohibition of jihad, Paul says, and I quote, I think that no one ought to be harmed and no one recompensed. So whoever does evil to you, do not give him what he deserves. If one slaps his cheek, let him turn to him the other. And if he takes some of his clothing, let him give him the rest of it. Let him give the rest of it. They accepted this and abandoned jihad, according to the writing of Saif Umar. This is what Paul said. So this is why Christians abandoned jihad. We're supposed to do jihad. Yeah, your comment there? Anything before I move on?
Well, I have a couple comments from earlier. I don't know if this is a good point to bring them up or.
Sure, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
First, just a couple of humorous comments. You can't even imagine this level of scholarship. But apparently you can imagine it because the Muslims did. And then
Yeah, no, it's
one can drive a bus through the holes in this story. And indeed, the story makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's not even internally consistent.
yeah. No, look, there's more details. I mean, once you actually, if I could have made this a lot shorter by just presenting like these are the stories, right? But
And,
yeah, it's ridiculous. So
and then one serious comment that I wanted to bring up here. It's from
mm,
earlier, but it's relevant. The Gnostic texts can be interpreted in many different ways because they are very vague. This would have been easier to adopt by the Muslims. And I think that's correct. The whole idea of Gnostic isn't, a particular set of religions doctrines. The idea of Gnostic is that only those who possess the secret hidden knowledge are the true elites, the ones that are truly following, God, if you like. So of course the texts are vague because you have to be enlightened. You have to be part of the secret knowledge to understand what they're really saying. And for this reason, it's very easy for anyone to read whatever they want to read into the text. And that's intentional by the authors of the texts.
yeah, I agree. So I mean, look, the Gnostic Gospels have no historical value. They have literally no archaeological value, whereas the New Testament and the Old Testament are used every day by archaeologists around the world, at least in that region, to prove, to find, to validate discoveries. Just briefly, you've got this is Ibn Taymiyyah, right? Ibn Taymiyyah presents Islam as a golden mean, superior to Judaism in severity towards unbelievers, and superior to Christianity in its compassion towards believers, right? So they believe that they're supposed to be severe. Ibn Taymiyyah states that Moses had the attributes of majesty and severity, Jesus those of beauty and compassion, and Muhammad the seal of the prophets that of perfection. Christianity is accused of corrupt features such as crosses allegedly suspended in midair, icons shedding tears, and the holy fire coming down in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem during Easter, regarded as a fabrication. Christians also accused of having renounced jihad, the duty to wage war on God's behalf. So one of the sins of Christianity is that we do not wage jihad on the enemies of God. We don't go and kill them. Right now, of course, they are happy to accuse us of going on jihad against, on the Crusades, but they're not happy about that somehow. And they do claim then, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, that the coming of the Prophet Muhammad was revealed in the Old Testament book of Habakkuk 3:13. Okay, and the religion of Abraham, of course, is Islam. So this is just something that just related to that. Okay, so this idea also existed with Ibn Taymiyyah. So Saif Umar. Finally, Paul has a vision.
Sorry, I didn't actually mean to put that comment up.
Okay.
Go on.
So Paul has a vision he wants to reveal only to a small group. So he sends away everyone except Jacob, Nestor, who founded the Nestorians, Malcolm, and a fourth, a guy called the Believer. He tries to convince them that God had in fact made himself manifest to them in the person of Jesus, but had withdrawn from their sight. So this statement caused discussions and dissension, and various Trinitarian doctrines arose because of what Paul said. I have no idea how that conclusion follows from that statement, but apparently so. According to the scholar, this is what happens. So Jesus had appeared and withdrawn, exactly like according to the Shia belief, the Imam had withdrawn from them. So the believers stressed that all of this was contradictory to the true teachings of Jesus. So consequently, the believer leaves them, he leaves the group, and he urges his followers to remain faithful to the only true teaching, that of Jesus, which of course is Islam. Each of the four, taken into Paul's confidence, gather a group of followers. The believer had the smallest group, the poor small group. Paul urged the other three to fight the believer and his followers. However, the believers fled to Palestine, where they were taken captive by the Jews. So they asked the Jews to leave them alone since they only wanted to live in caves, in hermitages, and on mountaintops and wander about the countryside. Their offspring introduced heresies into their religion, except for a small remnant, the real followers of the believer who survived among them and stayed loyal to their original doctrine. Some of them then escaped to the Arabian Peninsula, where 30 of them lived as monks and saw the Prophet Muhammad and then believed in him. So the role of Paul in the corruption of Christianity, according to this story, is the following. He corrupted some important sacred rules of the religious law, and he spoiled the kernel of the faith itself. So now, we'll start winding up here. So Al-Damari and Paul's sacrificial suicide. So now let's look at a scholar called Al-Damari. And the Christians say Christ is the Son of Allah. That is what they say with their mouths, Quran 9:3. In Al-Damari's Hayat al-Hayawan, quoted on the authority of Al-Qalbi, who died in 763. So in the story, the Christians follow Islam for 81 years. So the Christians were Muslims for 81 years after the ascension of Jesus. My bad. So Jesus ascends into heaven, and the Christians are following Islam for 81 years. I have no idea if there's a record. Maybe the Muslims can give us a record of these 81 years. I would love to see that. Then a war breaks out between many of the Jews, and as a subterfuge, Paul, who had killed many followers of Jesus, presents himself to the Christians as a repentant co-religionist. So he studies the gospel in their church for a whole year. He then departs for Jerusalem, and having taught Nestor that Jesus, Mary, and God were three members of the Trinity, he leaves them as his lieutenant. See, so the Quran claims that the Godhead is Jesus, Mary, and God, right? Right?
Yeah.
Don't forget.
Yeah.
And so that mistake is now blamed on Paul, because Paul taught it.
Oh, okay. Amazing
Right.
that Paul corrupted Christianity and created a religion of 2 billion people. Yet Paul also taught this doctrine, which we have no historical record of whatsoever. You'd think that the 2 billion followers of Paul would be aware of what Paul taught. I guess not.
Yeah, no. So not at all. So then Paul goes to the land of the Romans. I don't know, Turkey, the Byzantines, Rome, the land of the Romans, where he taught a man called Jacob that Jesus was not a man, but had become a man, that he had no body, but became a body, and that he was the Son of God. That's Gnostic through and through. Then he converted a man called Malkan, whom he taught that Jesus was and is God. And then, after Paul had killed himself as a sacrifice to Jesus, each of these three disciples began to call upon their fellow men to adopt their doctrine. This is the origin of the three Christian sects: Nestorianism, Monophysitism, and Christianity as we know it, basically. So apparently now Nestorianism and all these other sects date to the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. But Paul established them in the 1st century. So Paul was a time traveler.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, everything's Paul's fault, right? It doesn't matter when it happened, whether it was the 9th century BC when he was king of Jerusalem, or if it was the 4th century AD when these texts were written. It's all Paul. Doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, and there's this war, this crazy war that happened. Yeah, no records. Dulkarnain, who was he? He was one of the 4 greatest emperors of the time. Who was he? They can't tell us. They don't have a name. They don't know who he was. Well, the only option, besides if you reject the other 3 because they don't fit, is, well, Alexander. But hey, whatever. Yeah. So basically, I'm just going to
Lloyd,
skip
you're
that.
mistaken. Dulkarnain is Paul.
You're right. You're right. Okay. There's a story here. There is a traditional story that is used by Muslims to explain Paul's corruption. This slide is not finished. There's a new slide that I forgot I added. So an evil Jewish king and his vizier developed a plan to exterminate the local Christian community. Okay. So the king cuts off the ears, hands, and nose of his vizier, then banished him into exile. The vizier took refuge among the Christians, won their confidence by pretending that he had suffered his mutilation for their faith as a Christian. So great was his deceit that he won their favor and became a witness for Christ. He claimed to have the original Gospels and gave one copy to each of the local 12 Christian tribes and secretly appointed each as his successor. The scrolls contradicted each other on important matters of doctrine, and the vizier committed suicide after he realized that the differences in doctrine would lead to divisions of a doctrine. He wanted to cause division. So he was willing to have his hands, ears, and nose cut off. And in the Muslim world, the vizier of this tale came to be identified as Paul, and his later martyrdom in Rome came to be explained as an invention. This was Paul's suicide. Well, we know that King Saul, he was already confused with King Saul. King Saul committed suicide in atonement. And so now Paul, who was Saul, committed suicide. And King Saul, who was king of the Jews, right, in the time of David, right, and Saul, who was Paul, he was king of the Jews too. And so that's how they just confused the two. And this was used to cover up his suicide. This is by R.A. Nicholson, Some Notes in Arabian and Persian Folklore. And it's in the book, The Quranic Jesus, a study of parallels with non-biblical texts. So this is based on a pre-existent story, which is also a complete fabrication.
I didn't quite catch it, but in this accusation by this Muslim or whatever, they said that Paul collected or authorized the writing of Bibles and then sent them out to the different
No.
locations.
In this story, there's a parallel tale, a traditional tale used by Muslims. So they took an existing story of how Christianity got corrupted, and then it was suddenly adapted to Paul. Paul was suddenly added into the story. So the story is that there's an evil Jewish king, and he wants to exterminate the Christian community. He wants to destroy and corrupt the Christian community. So his vizier is very loyal to him, and the king cuts off the ears, the hands, and the nose of his vizier and sends him to the Christians. And this vizier then gains the sympathy of the Christians because he says he was mutilated because he was a Christian. They take him in, and now he's got 12 fake Bibles. Each one is different, and he gives them to the 12 leaders of the Christians, and they each have a different Bible, and therefore they're going to fight over what is right. So he made each one of them secretly, you're the leader. You're going to be the leader of the Christian church. Each one had completely different doctrine, and therefore they fought, and they all fought over the leadership. So it was planned to create confusion. So this apocryphal tale suddenly is adapted, and Paul is stuck into it.
I see. So this is very interesting, though, because it's very, at least to me, because it's very similar to the Muslim claims about the Quran, only reversed, right? They say that there was variant text errors, whatever, and then all those were gathered up and they were destroyed. And then Uthman released the correct Quran to each of the provinces of the Muslim lands at the time. So I feel like it's kind of, a reversal of that story.
Could well be, but they were obviously very good at writing these polemics, and they just repurposed an existing polemic. So I should sort of wind down here. I should end here, but hopefully that's interesting. I forgot I discovered this, and I needed to edit this into the story. But this whole story of Paul comes from an earlier story, and so that's an old myth that was told, and Paul was just fitted into that myth. So yeah, should I let me pause here? I think maybe that's sufficient just to give people an idea of what we're doing with this story.
So you want to continue this in 2 weeks, or?
Yeah, would that be all right?
Yep, that's fine by me. We'll discuss the exact date, whether you want to wait 2 weeks or whatever later. I do have a number.
Yeah, I think I'll be traveling that day, so I might want to do it next week. Maybe,
okay. Yeah, we'll figure out the date and we'll get that on the calendar.
Yeah. So hopefully this was entertaining and interesting. People have learned something about this polemic against St. Paul.
Absolutely. So I do have a number of comments that I gathered together while we were talking, and we can. Oops, I didn't mean to put that up. We'll put that one up last. But first up, we can go a little bit while longer. We can address a number of things that are not directly related to the topic. But first up, we got Steve Kahn here, who I had to block again because I had to time out again because even after he came out of timeout, he's like, I was on topic. And then he just kept talking about me. I'm not the topic of this discussion here. He says, talk about blocking. I get timed out. Yeah, I didn't block you. I timed you out. And I gave you the link to the stream. It's pinned in the chat. Come on, click on the link. Come up and talk. He said that, but then when I said that, in the chat, he was like, well, why would I talk to dishonest people? I don't know. Why would you talk to Dawa?
Why are you commenting then? What's the whole point?
Yeah, he's perfectly comfortable in the chat, but when he won't come up live because then I can challenge him on it. He said that last time we talked, I ran away because I didn't want to discuss the doctrine of original sin.
But he wants us to go on EF Dawa. Why would we talk with dishonest people?
Yeah, exactly. Why would we talk with dishonest people on EF Dawa? And they are very dishonest. They purposely block any Christians with knowledge, cut them off, and only allow people who look like fools to come on, whether they are Christians who don't know their own religion very well or the people pretending to be Christians, who knows. But either way, they only let people with no knowledge on. As soon as someone shows knowledge, they try to change the subject, and if they need to, they kick the person off and say, "Oh, his internet connection cut out," or whatever they need to do, or they usually won't make up a lie. They'll just say, "This guy's a waste of our time," and get rid of him. So yeah. Tommy Robinson says EF Dawa is scared of Thaddeus. This is why they sent their minion Steve Kahn, and I think that might be true. You know, they're welcome to come on my channel anytime they want. I'm not going to go on their channel where they can control and kick me off when I say something they don't like. But they're welcome to come on here. And, you know, I'm a man of my word. If I say I'll give someone 5 minutes interrupted, 10 minutes interrupted, whatever they ask
Look,
for.
I mean, they all have excuses for not coming on. They're terrified of us. Otherwise, they'd come on. I mean, you've invited what's his face how many times? I've invited him dozens of times on multiple different channels, and they always have an excuse for not showing up. All they have is excuses for not showing up. If they have something to present, why don't they make a presentation, come on the channel and present? We'll freely let you present. That show us. You know, if you think we're wrong, show us. You know, but yeah, I'm not scared. No, you see
Yeah,
now he's
yes,
not
you are
scared. We can go
scared.
on someone else's channel. He's not scared. We can go on someone else's channel.
Yeah. You know, I'm putting a link. I already pinned it, but I'll put it in the chat again. The link, you can come up, or you can send your EF Dawa boys and have them come on up. But if you're not scared, then you can come up and discuss on my channel. You know, like I said, I'm a man of my word. If whatever you ask for, if I grant it, I will give it to you. I'm not the kind of person who's going to be like, "Oh, why don't you come up to discuss original sin since that's what you wanted to talk about?" And then as soon as you come up, change the subject to someone else, like the Muslim that we had on Adam Seeker's channel a couple of days ago, who said he wanted to come up to talk about the Sharia. And then as soon as he got up, "Oh, I don't know anything about Sharia." Then they said, "Well, what about the subject we're discussing?" "I don't know anything about that." "Oh, what about uh, in the comments where you were talking about how Allah doesn't pray?" "I don't know anything about that. I came up to discuss Muhammad in the Old Testament, which was not the subject of the stream. It was not something he had ever mentioned in chat." I'm not the kind of person who will pull that crap. If you say you
Of
want to
course
come
he's
up here to
scared. This
discuss
guy's
original
terrified to come
sin,
up. Of course,
come
you're
up to discuss
terrified,
original
Steve. You're
sin.
scared. You're Steve Kant, not Steve Can. You're Steve Kant. Admit
Oh,
it. You're all scared. You're all terrified of coming up.
millions of Christians have converted to Islam because Christianity offers nothing. This is fascinating. Millions of Christians have converted to Islam. Where's your evidence for that, Steve? Where's your evidence for anything? You don't have any. You're afraid to come up. Stop wasting our time. Either come up or run away like the child you are.
Yeah, so that's my story today. So that's my story. I mean, I've invited over the last 2 years, I've invited every idiot, and you guys are idiots, whoever has commented on my channel and on other channels I've been on. I've invited everyone I deal with to come on my channel. Let's talk about Islamic law. Let's talk about the fiqh. Not one, not a single one. All I get is excuses. Not one of you has been willing to accept. We'll just come on, we'll open the fiqh, and we'll read it. This is from your most absolute best scholars. For some reason, doesn't happen. So you guys are terrified.
Asking key questions says, "I appreciate the way you handle Muslim attempts at distraction. If I ever get my own channel going, hope to learn from the way you do this." And I appreciate that very much. Uh, just real quick, one last comment from Steve Com. "You complained about EF Doc blocking people. The irony, buddy, you're not blocked. We can read your comments. You're not blocked here. So what is ironic exactly? The fact that I'm allowing you to come up and give your argument, that is ironic because EF Dawa just blocks people and doesn't who have knowledge. You kind of need to learn the definitions of words. Oh, and he says, "Okay, bye. Bye, Steve. Run away, child." All right. So now some serious comments now that we got all that garbage out of the way. This was from early on, but it didn't directly apply, so I said we'd address it at the end. Dimensionally Known says, "Can you please mention a little bit about Paul's argument with Peter and how it may apply to the Muslim polemics against Paul. He's, of course, referring to the confrontation between Peter and Paul, where Paul kind of calls Peter out for continuing to follow the Jewish law, but only doing so in front of Jewish people. While he's in front of Gentiles, he's happy to act like a Gentile, but when he's in front of Jews, he's like, no, 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 I'm still a Jew. And of course, Paul calls Peter out for this, and Peter kind of acknowledges that he was being a little bit hypocritical. But do you think that this might relate to the Muslim polemics in any way?
I mean, this is the closest they can come to finding an instruction. Look, we can go into Islam and we can find literal chapters, an entire book dedicated to Muslims, teaching them how to lie. They have entire chapters on it. This is one verse which basically translates as, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Because I'm familiar with the Jews, I can talk to them in a language they understand. And because I'm familiar with the Christians, I can relate to them as well. That's all it means. Whereas there are actual literal instructions for Muslims on how to lie, when to lie, who to lie to, many different kinds of lying. Lying is integral to Islam. So,
absolutely. This comment, I probably should have brought this one up first since it relates to Steve Kahn. Tommy said that I should just block any trolls. And I tend not to block people. Sometimes people give me no choice because they just refuse to listen and they continue to spam crap, and I have no choice to block them. But I do try not to block people. Tommy advocates for a quick blocking, and he's welcome to do whatever he thinks is best on his own channel. But Sonny says, Tommy, you need Abduls to pass on the message to the senior Abduls. And I brought this comment up because I think it makes a good point here. If you just block someone and you don't address their arguments in any way, they think they won. But if we continue to entertain the idiot, then they'll realize that their arguments aren't working. And you know what they'll do? They'll go to their teacher. They'll go to the one who's instructed them on how to memorize all these idiotic arguments that they can't defend.
yeah,
And thus we know that they didn't come up with it themselves. So then they go back to the more knowledgeable person, and then it pushes the narrative. It pushes
yeah.
Muslims to start to admit things. For
So,
example, the holes in the narrative thing that happened a year ago.
yeah.
All of a sudden, Muslims are now claiming they always knew this material, and when in fact they did not.
Yeah. So actually, I need to go. I'm here later than anticipated. I have family
Okay, I'm
visiting,
sorry.
so I'm
Uh,
I'm so
oh,
sorry about that. I should have actually ended earlier.
Alrighty.
Um,
Take care, Lloyd. I'll go ahead and finish out the comments on my own.
okay. Thanks, guys. Till next time. See you soon, Thaddeus. Bye.
So comment here from Tommy. One of the main arguments against St. Paul is that he abolished circumcision, but if you ask any Mohammedan to show circumcision in the Quran, they are helpless. Fascinating material there, that they think that this is a corruption of Paul, but they can't show it from their own history. And this happens a lot. They claim that Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael, but they can't show that in their own Quran or any other early text. The end result is that we see that Muslim arguments have continued to develop in response to Christian and polemics against them. This is the area that I am currently digging into, seeing how Muslim arguments have been shaped by Christian polemics, and see how the narrative changed. And by seeing how it changes in response to polemics, we can get back to what the original Muslims originally believed and show that what we call Islam has nothing to do with what Muhammad or whoever else were the original teachers were teaching, which is total destruction of Islam as we know it. Basel Getty Blaster says that they demonstrate how widespread and established the apostolic church were in the 2nd century. I believe this was given in response to talking about the Gnostic texts and whatnot. I'm not 100% certain, but it's definitely something that the non-canonical texts show us. They show us that the canonical texts were already widely accepted as authoritative. Well, how do they do that? Well, it's because they only try to fill in gaps for the most part. They only try to address things that the canonical scriptures didn't address. For example, the childhood of Jesus is a very popular subject in these. But that only makes sense if they already knew about the canonical scriptures, and these were already so well established that they couldn't just make up things about Jesus's public ministry. They had to go somewhere else to make up their doctrine. So yes, the apocryphal texts, the texts written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, pretty much right up until the invention of the printing press, people continued to invent these texts. They show us a number of things. They don't directly show us anything of historical relevance about the historical Jesus, but what they do show us, one is the beliefs of the communities that created these texts, and two, they indirectly show us what the Orthodox beliefs were, because these people were writing against the Orthodox beliefs. So they indirectly show us what the Orthodox beliefs already were at that time. Just a funny comment here from Vedant. Muslims can't find their left shoe. Finding a record is a far-fetched dream. And you know what? I've been challenging Muslims that come to my channel for a couple years now, 3 years, to bring evidence. And you're right. They never bring any historical reference. They bring empty rhetoric, and they bring red herring fallacies, and they bring tu quoque fallacies, but they never bring any historical record arguing for the truth of Islam. Amazing stuff. Jib says, wow, Muslims believe there was a war between Jews and Christians in the 2nd century. And at least in the 11th century, that's what their best scholars came up with for an excuse as to how the original message of Jesus supposedly became corrupted. Jimmy English, I can't believe this narrative even exists. Absolutely. These stories are so ridiculous. Lloyd did not preview this material for me, so this was the first time I was hearing some of it, which I had such a strong reaction laughing at it. And it's just hard to believe that anyone actually created this in all seriousness, that this is the best they could come up with. This is their best argument that Paul corrupted Islam, that Paul corrupted the Muslim teachings of Jesus. This is what they come up with, and it just shows how utterly desperate they were, how utterly clueless they were about actual history to come up with these arguments of all things. I did note this here. Since Lloyd is no longer with us, I'll pass it on to him later to let him know about some typos and such on his slides. I definitely appreciate that, and I imagine Lloyd will want to get those corrected as well. Question here, what about Paul wanting to go to hell? Are you talking about when Paul says he would, if he could, sacrifice himself for his own Jewish brethren so they might be saved? I realize this was a side conversation here, but it could maybe explain where they got this idea that Paul committed suicide. Probably not, though. It's probably just from the story of Saul, that King Saul was said to have committed suicide in the rabbinic writings. So and we see the rabbinic writings influence Islam quite often. So they probably just got the idea from there, and they confused who Saul was. They thought that Saul and the Apostle Paul were the same person, which reflects the same sloppy thinking as the Quran, thinking that two Marys that lived 1,000 years apart were the same person. So that's all the comments that I had saved. I will try to see if there's anything else given more recently that needs addressed here. The Gnostic Gospels, like the Hadith, provide an excellent example of legendary accrual and myth development over time. And that's a good point as well. And that's another thing that we can see from the Gnostic Gospels. The fact that these have survived is actually strong evidence of the truth of the canonical accounts, because we can compare what fairly early, in some cases, legendary development looks like and compare it to the original. we can see quite bizarre and extraordinary things coming forth. And likewise, in the Hadith, you can see some things that are perfectly ordinary, but you also kind of see the development of new ideas, the development of myths. And by backtracking between these things, we can kind of get a clearer picture of what happened historically than we could just from looking at the better source texts. We get our primary information from the better text, but we can get a more complete picture and have more confidence in the picture that we're drawing by looking at both, accepted texts and unaccepted texts. Vilna said, "This is why book burning is so stupid, Thaddeus." Absolutely. I think that the story of Uthman burning the original Quranic text is probably not true. It probably was created as an explanation for why later Muslims were trying to canonize the text, why they were trying to get rid of textual variants. They probably created this story as a justification for their own efforts to remove variants in the Quranic manuscripts. But whatever the origin of the story, it's really quite pathetic, because the more information we have, the more we can get to the original. Muslims apparently, starting in about the 13th century, decided that they didn't care what the supposed words of Allah were. They only cared about what was most valuable for their polemic apologetic purposes. So they totally abandoned any pretense of looking at Qurans and trying to figure out the original manuscripts, what the original words of the Quran supposedly were. And they just totally abandoned that. And for that reason, because of this stupid perfect preservation myth, even today, there's no text critical Quran, which is absolutely pathetic, because there's a text critical version of every important work of ancient history, basically. Even many works that are not that important, like example of an important work, say something like the Iliad. And of course, there's a text critical Bible, but there's also text critical everything. There's a text critical Iliad, there's a text critical Odyssey, there's text critical versions of the works of Aristotle and Plato and everything else of importance of ancient history, except for the Quran, because Muslims are afraid of the text. They're afraid of the evidence. They rather have this fake version of this fake narrative about perfect preservation than the words of their supposed God himself. And it's just absolutely pathetic. Let's see. Give me a second here to read through some of these comments. Normally I read while Lloyd's talking. I'm not talented enough to read and talk at the same time. Juliet says they have a Dawa script and they parrot it. Sarfaraz Hussein, I think it was actually Safraz Hussein, but whichever, was a classic example on Adam Seeker's channel 2 days ago. And yes, that's what I was alluding to earlier. They have a script, they have a memorized set of arguments, and once they get off script, they're lost. They don't know what to do. And one, we could just say, all right, you're just an idiot repeating a script, you're wasting my time, block you. Or we can push them until they're off the script, and then at least it creates, at least the person has to realize that they don't have sufficient knowledge to make the arguments they're making. They may dishonestly continue to repeat them. They may dishonestly continue to act like they have an airtight case. But they have to know deep down that they don't, because as Safraz was like, I don't know. I have to ask someone about that. I don't know. And that's all he could say over and over again. So that's why I quote unquote waste my time pushing Muslims on these kinds of issues. If anyone had something important from earlier that they want me to address, go ahead and re-put that in the chat. the Gnostic Gospels were in 1 to 3 centuries, and later, yes, definitely, and later, after Jesus died, by people who never have been witnesses or known witnesses to the events they report. And absolutely, like I said, historically, they have no value for telling us what Jesus actually said, what Jesus actually did. But they do have value in because they allow us to determine that the canonical texts were already accepted, that this was already the well-recognized information. And keep in mind, 1 century after Jesus died is a whole century earlier than the canonical texts of Islam, other than the Quran itself, come from. So they're giving us texts that come 2 or more centuries after the time of Muhammad, and telling us that they give accurate pictures of what Muhammad said and did, which is not, it's not inherently impossible, but it's a big red flag. So the contrast between Christianity and Islam is pretty strong on the historical point, that the only real historical source that Muslims have that a historian would view as likely accurate as far as the history of how Islam developed would be the Quran, and it says almost nothing about Muhammad or the development of Islam. It's supposedly just giving people a reminder of the scriptures that came before them. So it can only give us subtle hints about things that were going on in that era. It's definitely not a history in the sense that we understand history. Question: can you and Lloyd debunk atheist claims about the Bible, like infancy Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, and so forth? I don't have a lot of interest in speaking directly to atheists. Just not my area of interest. I spoke to atheists probably 10 years before I started speaking about Islam. And basically 95% of the conversation, 95% of the time, the conversation would end up being the atheist saying, your evidence is insufficient, therefore you have no evidence, therefore atheism is true. As in their entire spiel was, I don't have to accept your argument because of X, Y, and Z, therefore I'm right, which is not valid. You have to actually have a positive case for your belief, and atheists almost never attempt to do that. Gnostics focus on secret knowledge. Ever notice how Muslims refer to their scholars as students of knowledge? And you're on to something here. Lloyd is eventually going to get to the Gnostic foundation of Islam. Islam is actually surprisingly very similar to Gnostic ideas, in that there's this level of secret knowledge that only the elite are allowed to possess, and that it's kept from the majority. And we see this in a number of ways, but we especially see it in the average Muslim saying, I can't answer that question. I can't do my own research. I have to go ask my teacher. I have to go ask my scholar. I have to go ask my imam. And that Islam strongly discourages thinking for oneself, because only the elite have this secret knowledge. Only these elite really know what Islam's about. And if you try to speak without knowledge, then you might make a gross error that might take you outside the fold of Islam. Villainous says Lloyd is stalking the chat, and he does. He said he had to get off, but then he's right back here in the chat. But that's all right. I'm sure that being on and speaking is quite a bit different than kind of sort of looking at the chat and responding to it. Couple things. They're very different things. You can do one with, family is present and you're talking with family, and you can't very well be going on the broadcast and talking if you're also trying to talk to people in the same room as you. Thank you, Lloyd, for sharing so many great resources. Absolutely. Later, I'll put a link to the references that Lloyd had in this stream. We unfortunately didn't think about that ahead of time, so they're not in the description right now. but they will be within the next 24 hours. And I definitely encourage people to check out the original resources. I definitely always encourage people to check out things for themselves. Christianity is not afraid of the truth because we have the truth. Islam is afraid of the truth. They only want to talk about Christianity because they do not have the truth. I am quite confident that an honest investigation of things always leads to Christianity. Basalgeti pointed out that not all apocryphal Christian writings are necessarily Gnostic or unorthodox. They can be received as Christian romances developed on the gospel. For example, Nicodemus, James, and the Infancy Gospel. And that's correct. Not all of these texts are heretical. Not all of them teach something different. Many of them are very much orthodox, but they are later developments. And this is actually more evidence that the church made the correct choices. They didn't just choose something because of the doctrine it contained. They chose the things that to their best judgment were original, and to the best judgment of modern scholars, they were right. They universally picked the texts that were earlier and universally rejected the texts that were later, regardless of whether those later texts were orthodox or unorthodox in their teachings. The only example of texts that are roughly contemporary with the gospel that did not enter into the New Testament are Orthodox Christian texts that were given by non-apostolic authorities, written by later people that teach the same thing, but did not come directly from an apostle and thus did not make it into the New Testament. This might be the last comment here, unless anyone has something that they need to get out. This will be the last comment. Both Muslims and atheists use the lack of any positive evidence as evidence for their own claims, and this is very much a pattern that Muslims and atheists share in common. They think that by refuting something else, not that they actually refute it, but by attempting to refute something else, they somehow prove their own beliefs to be true. And that is totally irresponsible. That is not how you come to truth. You do not come to truth through a process of elimination. There are more than 3,000 recognized religions in the world today, by which I mean things that have enough following for the people who study religions to give it a distinct name. And in reality, there's, millions of different religions because each person has slightly different beliefs. So unless you're prepared to refute all 3,000 plus different religions on the planet, then you need to actually create a positive case for your own beliefs. I think Christianity has a very good, strong, positive case to be made. I think that the gospel accounts in particular stand up to historical scrutiny. I think the best explanation for all of the evidence that can be established by normal historical inquiry, not by first assuming the Bible to be true, but rather by first assuming it to just be an ordinary document that was written by ordinary people. I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying even if you make that assumption, you start with that assumption, that the evidence that can be established on concrete means, on the historical method, a number of lines of evidence come together, and the best explanation that explains all of them at the same time is that Jesus really rose from the dead. But if Jesus really rose from the dead, then what Jesus taught needs to be taken seriously. And if what Jesus taught needs to be taken seriously, then we basically get the entirety of the Bible as a side effect of Jesus's resurrection. We can argue directly for other things in the Bible, but we don't really need to. If Jesus rose from the dead, then there's clearly something going on here. It establishes that there is a God, because there's no natural explanation for rising from the dead. And the attempts to avoid it don't really hold up to scrutiny. And two, it says that this person is special. This is someone you need to listen to. And Jesus, of course, teaches the Old Testament theology. He teaches the New Testament theology as well. So we get basically all of Christianity, maybe not some finer points that are debated within Christianity, but we get basically everything that is core to Christian belief solely from the historical fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And just following up on that, offense attacking Christianity makes for a great defense, especially if it's your only available defense. Yeah, if you can't support Islam on its own merits, if I was forced physically or emotionally to be a Muslim and remain a Muslim, I would probably do the same thing, to be honest. I would probably spend all my time trying to talk about other things, trying to prove what the Quran teaches, that people outside of Islam are the worst of all creatures, lower than animals and dogs and so forth. And if I could establish that they're pretty despicable, well, then I can pretend to have confidence in my own beliefs without any direct proof for them. Question, did you see the little video about the apology of Aristides circa 140 that Bob made last week? Fascinating text I've never seen before. I have heard of that text. I have not seen Bob's video, nor have I read the text myself. So I will join you in checking out what Bob has to say about that. So thank you all for joining us today. Sadly, as usual, despite the opportunity, no Muslim could come up and defend their faith. But we do see that their arguments against Paul are quite silly, and that the people who made these arguments had no clue what they were talking about. And sadly, the same holds true today, that 99% of the time when you find a Muslim giving some argument against Christianity, they have not done any research whatsoever themselves and are just blindly parroting an argument that either they read somewhere or they were told by someone to use this argument against Christians, because they have no response. As soon as you get them off the script, they have no answers because they have not thought things through for themselves. And really, that's all I ask of anyone who is a Muslim. I just ask that you start thinking for yourselves. I know that's a very dangerous thing to do in Islam, but consider this: your eternal soul is on the line. Do you really want to just blindly hope that you have the right religion, or do you want to investigate? If Islam is true, then any investigation of the truth should confirm what you already believe. And if Islam is false, then you should want to know that. You shouldn't just want to blindly hope that you have the right religion. Investigate the evidence and you will find the truth. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the light," and indeed he is the truth. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week, and God bless.